could see from 2 blocks away in his jeep. Ahead of him, Route 347 wavered with a hazy heat. The morning was already hot. 24 hours had passed since his negotiations with Osborne. Afterwards, he shut down the computer and made a beeline for bed, plummeting to the mattress like a defeated boxer to the mat. He slept a feverish sleep that sucked him deeper the more he tried to rise out of it, as if he were struggling in a vat of warm mud. Somewhere in another reality, distant, not his own, he heard gunshots, explosions. He slept through the afternoon, the evening, the night again. When he'd finally opened his eyes this morning, he felt healthier. The soreness in his throat had relented. His sinuses were clear, his airways alive once more with fresh, flowing oxygen. He relaxed, suddenly aware that he'd been concerned. But there was definitely no resurrection in his body. No raw meat for me. And so he'd gotten up. He boiled water in the fireplace for a quick wash, then dressed and packed his gear and firearms. Out the door, just after 7. He'd finally succumbed to Osborne's plan. Reluctantly, but at the same time, perhaps grateful for the extra manpower, to meet the Resurrection Resistance Unit in the town of Maricopa, an hour south. Roger Ballard, he now thought for the 100th time as he drove. He frowned, still rattled by last night, the dredging up of that name. What the hell was Osborne plotting? Why the need to return Roger? National security was all that Osborne had offered. Something's not right, Marco fretted. I should have said no. But then again, he didn't really have a choice. Osborne was a true bastard. The threats had been bad enough, Marco thought, but using Danielle like that to manipulate him... Christ, he'd practically been on his knees, begging for the job. He scowled now, remembering the questions Osborne had put to him. The same cruel questions that loomed over him every day out here in this wasteland, beating down on him like the sun. Why haven't you found her? Why is this taking so goddamn long? Christ, he'd tried. Staked out 100 spots she should have been. The wedding chapel in Hollywood. The resort in Carefree. Their first apartment in L.A., and the coffee shop they'd gone to for a first date. And the Arizona house, of course. 4 years there, waiting for her to show. He'd looked everywhere. Every place that meant something. That should have meant something to her. Unless he was wrong. His chest ached. He didn't want to doubt her. "Perhaps you've begun to wonder," Osborne had commented. Yeah, perhaps. The image of her empty Honda flickered at the back of his eyes, ghostly and half-formed. It appeared to him often in moments like these, particularly when he was tired and depressed, and always more images followed, and once they began, they were hard to stop. Himself in his Audi on the first day of the resurrection, speeding madly across town to rescue Danielle from the unfathomable chaos of screaming people and broken glass and ambulance sirens and dead monsters chasing him. And suddenly he slammed his brakes, and there was her Honda, crumpled around a splintered telephone pole. Her silly license plate, yin-yang, mocking him as he sprinted across the street, dodging corpses. No, 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 he thought. Bloody brown handprints on the open doors, the engine still hissing and steaming. No, 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 fuck, fuck, fuck. The driver's seat soaked with guts, loops of intestine, half a bitten liver, the floor mat submerged in blood, her red footprints exiting the car, disappearing into the desert, and he'd never seen her again. "Stop!" he said, and slammed his fist on the car horn. The brazen honk broke the daydream apart, sent the unwelcome thoughts scattering. "No more!" he ordered. Immediately he regretted the reckless horn blow. "Don't announce yourself, asshole," he thought, forcing his concentration back to the road, watching for what he called early risers. Corpses never slept, but after a night-long chill in the dark, sunlight seemed to trigger a higher state of activity in some. Probably another echo of their lives, distinct to personality and habit. Just after dawn, you were likely to find white-haired corpses staggering along sidewalks, the elderly, out for a sunrise stroll. Dead kids, too, acting on impulse to catch a school bus, maybe, or deliver papers. He'd once had to bolt from a corpse in jogging shorts. The calf muscles on its right leg were chewed off completely, just a gray stick of bone crammed into a crusted Nike sneaker. Early risers were no real danger, not while driving. There were never many of them. But smacking a corpse in the road could damage the Jeep, maybe knock a part loose under the hood. And the last thing Marco needed was engine trouble. His plan was to drive to Maricopa and join with the railroad tracks past the train station, steer the Jeep up the gravel embankment, and drop right onto the tracks. Then follow the rails all the way to Los Angeles, with the RRU tailing behind in their truck. Bumpy, yes, but the surest way to cover long distances. He'd thought up the trick 2 years ago. On highways in the evacuated states, you were almost certain to run into a ghost jam somewhere along the drive. Thousands of empty cars and trucks clogging the road at unpredictable points, abandoned during the evacuation. Terrified drivers caught in standstill traffic, forced to get out and run when mobs of the dead came swarming up the ramps, choking off any escape. Entire families became easy meals. Now half the roads in America were just miles of rusting metal and sun-baked bones, impossible to pass. Crawling with hungry dead, too. He'd tried once to hike through on foot. Big mistake. He'd been lucky to reach an overpass, jumped into a river to escape 100 corpses. So, railroad tracks were the answer. No traffic, no getting lost. Just straight shots from point A to point B, over all kinds of terrain. Big cities, thick forests, grand mountains, you name it. Marco had plotted today's course on the map before leaving the house. Pick up the rail at Maricopa, then 400 miles west, exiting Arizona, up towards Los Angeles. He ditched the tracks far enough outside the city before the area turned too population-heavy and dangerous. The Maricopa train station glinted in the sun again, closer now. The station was a tourist attraction of sorts, an actual dome railroad car from the classic California Zephyr line, unhitched and deposited alongside the eastbound tracks, converted into a steel depot. He'd visited it once before the resurrection, not as a passenger, but on a self-guided sightseeing tour he and Danielle had taken 5 years ago, back when they'd first moved to Arizona. Those first few weekends they'd bought travel books, explored the scenic driving routes, introduced themselves to the highlights of their new state. On that morning they'd toured the Gila River Heritage Center, absorbing Native American folklore and mysticism. Danielle loved it, while in Marco's opinion it was a large overdose of feathers and turquoise beads. Afterwards, they'd followed the itinerary west to Maricopa, to the famous Silver Horizon train station. "Interesting," Danielle had commented, sounding unsure what else to say. It wasn't very exciting, really, just an old metal husk in the desert. They'd driven past the station without stopping, then eaten lunch at a run-down pizza joint a few blocks down the street. Marco frowned. That pizza place. He wasn't far from it now, just another intersection or two. Worth checking out? Finding her there would be a massive long shot. It was just a place where they'd eaten once, no special significance, and he couldn't remember a single thing they'd talked about during the meal. But then again, you never knew what might bubble to the surface in a dead brain, and Christ, he was running out of places to look. He'd even revisited the Gila River Heritage Center a year back. Nothing there, except a few dozen Maricopan Indian corpses lurking in damp earthen homes, crawling out to bite at him. But no Danielle. He turned left and coasted into the small station parking lot, opposite a dingy auto parts store and a ramshackle Mexican restaurant called Papi's. The air bogged with a smell like excrement, thick and nauseating. Outside his bug-spattered windshield, the gray depot greeted him, looking lonelier than he remembered it, a coach car divorced from its train. He peered farther up the street. Somewhere off in that direction was the pizza place. In his chest he felt the faint tug that always accompanied these glimpses of possibility, pulling him along, almost impossible to resist. He sighed. If he didn't check this restaurant out, he'd spend the next month convinced she'd been there, sitting forever in one of those cheap red vinyl booths, waiting for a shitty vegetarian pizza that would never arrive from the kitchen. At the thought, his eyes glossed. That did it. He had to go look. He swallowed uncomfortably and swung the Jeep through a clumsy U-turn in the parking lot, the tires crunching as they stirred the gravel. He'd pop over to the pizza place, get back here before the RRU showed. Back on Route 347, he drove a block. Darkened storefronts and shopping plazas beckoned from the roadside, their windows bleak with dust. A plumbing supply store, a grocery market, a laundromat. His eyes darted in and out of each. He felt his mind racing ahead of the Jeep, rehearsing his entrance into the pizza shop. Footsteps loud in the foyer, the crackle of brittle linoleum under his boots. He steps into the dining area, and there she is, Danielle, at a round table. Her face is wrapped in shadow, but he knows her immediately. Her hair is still short, still the red-brown of autumn, but stiff like straw. He speaks her name softly. She turns to him, a dry rasping in her throat. A sudden squeal, loud and jarring, made him jump. His eyes shot to the rear-view mirror in time to see a green truck skid through the intersection behind the Jeep, towards the station, fast, and burning. Jesus, shit, Christ! The truck, a military transport, was on fire. Flames surged across the hood, whipping over the canvas roof like the mane of a demon animal, thunderclouds of black smoke fuming from the cab. The tires screamed again, and the truck pitched left, bucking the curb, slamming head-on into an electric transformer box outside the train station. With an obscene screech of metal ripping metal, the truck rocked on two wheels and then rolled entirely onto its back, crushing the roof, showering sparks outward as the steel frame grated the cement. It flattened a grove of brown, prickly bushes and stopped 50 feet from the station, its tires spinning in the air. The fire poured upwards through the wheel wells, igniting the dry brush into stalks of red and orange, and the tires began to bubble, and the smoke turned even blacker. Marco sat dumbfounded, staring into his rearview mirror. The entire crash had played out with such speed he hadn't even turned to look through the back window. He turned now, his heart galloping, and that's when he saw the man in the wreckage. Upside down in the driver's seat, hands pounding the windshield, stuck in a death chamber as the flames raged into the cab. With utter hopelessness, Marco observed the burning truck, the driver roasting alive. The wreck was an inferno, rescue impossible. And then he blinked twice. "What the hell?" he shrugged. "Never know till you try," and kicked his own ass into action. He slapped the gear in reverse and twisted to see through the back window as he stomped the gas, and with a frantic squeal of rubber the Jeep launched like a backwards torpedo down the street. For half a second it shot towards the burning truck, then knifed sideways, off course. The metal pole of a street lamp rushed at him through the rear window, and he jerked the wheel, and the Jeep swerved again, missing the pole and a mailbox before slamming the curb opposite the station, launching him vertically in his seat. His head cracked against the overhead interior light, and his teeth knocked together with an alarming clatter of enamel. Scalp throbbing, he thrust the Jeep into park and reached for his bag. God damn it! The gear had dumped all over the passenger side floor mat. A mess of maps, flashlight batteries, ammo, foil bags of freeze-dried beef, chicken, and veggies. And his gun, the Glock, somewhere in the jumble. Furiously he searched the floor, the back seat, the crevice between the side door. No gun. Couldn't find the fucking gun. He heard a wail from the burning wreck of the military truck. Screw it, he thought. No time. He scrambled from the Jeep and gasped. Even here, 20 yards from the truck, the heat was fearsome, as if a massive hand had reeled back and slapped him full force the moment he emerged. He slit his eyes to see. A churning cloud of red and black fire raged from the upside-down truck, stealing up the sides, snaking through the exposed underbelly of cylinders and pipes. The air was oily with the funk of burning tires, and the smoke grated his eyeballs like sandpaper. He inhaled, but his throat rejected the air, racking him instead with a fit of foul-tasting coughs. Christ! He wrestled his T-shirt from his chest and covered his mouth with the soft, cool cotton. Sucking for air, he circled around the truck to the front cab, where he'd seen the man trapped. The windshield was spider-webbed, blackened with soot. Impossible to see inside. A burst of flames billowed sideways from the wreck, stoked by a passing desert breeze. He crouched an edge closer, risking a view into the driver's window. "Hey!" he shouted. Through the curtain of smoke, a hand slapped the glass. The palm pressed pink and bloody against the window. Then it pulled away and slapped again. "Hang on!" Marco yelled. He bundled his shirt around his fingers and grabbed for the scalding metal door. The handle turned without effort, but the door rattled only an inch in its frame. The crash had buckled the doors, rendering them inoperable. Deep in the smoke on the other side of the window, a red glow began to throb like a heart. The seats had caught fire. The man's hand clawed the glass with a new, heightened vigor. Through the murk, Marco glimpsed a terrified face. A bald, black man, thrashing, his mouth prized open in pain. Marco's thoughts reeled. If he had the Glock, he could shoot the glass out. Or a tire iron, back somewhere in the Jeep. He'd have to dig for it. Or use his fists. Or boots. His heavy-duty size 12 boots. Serious shit-kickers. He'd stomped enough corpse skulls these past few years to know. Dropping, he crawled to the front of the truck and rolled to his back, knees squared, taking aim at the already cracked windshield. The upside-down hood loomed above him, crumpled open an inch, hissing angrily, radiator ruptured, steam seething out. The stink of gasoline was everywhere, an invisible timer counting critical seconds. How long till the tank blows? Till the whole truck goes up in a fireball, and me with it? He kicked as hard as he could. Pain laced up his shins and resonated in his knees, but the glass held. He kicked again. The windshield buckled, sagged inward along a dozen fault lines, but did not break. Stinging sweat ran into his eyes as he kicked a third time. The glass at last buckled, and his left boot punched a hole straight through into the cab. He felt the trapped man grabbing at his foot, slipping off. "Hold on!" Marco shouted. "Almost done!" He pedaled his legs furiously until the hole had widened. A jagged mouth 2 feet across, vomiting ugly charcoal fumes. The smoke engulfed Marco. He batted it from his face, hacking, lungs revolting. How the hell could the man inside breathe? Forceful hands clamped down on his ankles and pulled. Marco slid a foot forward, deeper through the broken windshield. "Hey!" he called, surprised. Hidden in the smoke, panicking, the man hauled again. "Wait!" Marco said as he bounced forward, seeing his body disappear into the hole up to his waist. He felt his canvas pants bunch, flames ripping at his calves, cold hands seizing his shins. At once the frigid, familiar shock of dead skin against his own electrified the nerves in Marco's legs, surged up his spine, lit him with terror. "Oh, fuck," he sputtered. Not a man in the truck. A fucking corpse. "Get it off!" Every tendon in his legs went wild at once, and he kicked madly, desperately, blindly. His lower body was lost in the black smokestorm beyond the windshield. He couldn't see his own feet. Had no idea how near his flesh came to the dead man's teeth. He felt his shin crack against hard bone, the corpse's jaw, or forehead perhaps, and he cried out in horror, certain for a millisecond he'd been bitten. And then a muscular arm coiled around his knee, and the corpse dragged him another half-foot into the smoke. The heat was livid, agonizing. Fire seethed along the green surface of the hood, 2 feet from his face, a terrible whistle in his ears. In seconds he'd either burn to death or be eaten alive. Determined, he slammed his hands to the windshield, locking his elbows to keep from being pulled through. The glass itself had become another monster, superheated. Red blisters bubbled across his palms and broke instantly, leaving raw, rosy puddles, and he screamed. But he had no choice. He strained against the windshield, arching his back, fighting the rotten weight attached to his legs. His arms shook. He gained an inch back in his favor, then 6 inches. But then an ashen hand struck from the smoke, seizing him just above his knee, as a beastly growl cut through the fumes. A moment later the corpse's head broke into the clean air. The skull was burnt hairless. The brown skin melted away in white gummy patches. One eye socket was empty, hollowed out, wafting smoke. Gasping, Marco snatched his hand from the hot windshield and planted them on the pavement, crying out again as tiny squares of broken safety glass ate into his torn skin. From the wreck, a hurricane of fire swallowed the corpse's face. The flames shot over Marco's bare chest. He bucked with a rush of adrenaline, fueled by the pain, and wrestled another few feet back onto the pavement. His boots cleared the windshield, the soles spewing greasy, noxious smoke. The corpse hung on, stubborn, its head thrashed from side to side like a panicked animal's, its lips pulled and snarling. Its other arms sprang from the wreck, grabbed at the glass, hoisted itself forward, until finally the dead man's huge body crashed atop Marco's shins, pinning him. The corpse was on fire, flames consuming its back. Blackened tatters of a military uniform clung to its charbroiled muscles. A soldier, its single eye fixed on Marco, and he felt its fingers dig tighter, the pressure mounting until he swore his kneecaps would pop apart. Strong fucker, Marco strained, fighting panic himself. No good. The corpse had too much weight on him now. The soldier was at least 250, a real badass of sinew and strength. It had clawed farther up Marco's body, mouth stretched wide, snapping down. But with his quickest reflex, Marco lunged just ahead of the bite and jammed his thumb squarely into the corpse's empty eye socket, hooking the orbital bone. The corpse's head jolted to a stop. It chopped at the air, fighting, unable to connect with the meat on Marco's legs. Marco drove his thumb deeper, felt it sink into an awful squishiness inside the skull. Black juice splashed from the hole. Marco cringed. He knew from experience that the cuts on his hands weren't big enough to suck the resurrection into his veins. He'd stopped worrying about nicks and scrapes years ago, but, Jesus, he still hated corpse blood anywhere on him. Come on, quit being a baby and focus, he thought. Now what? A mangled cry from up the street answered him. He twisted his head, following the sound. 4 more corpses had emerged from the auto parts store on the corner, shuffling towards him, wet, hungry noises gargling in their throats. The burning corpse crushed Marco with its full weight. With a quick strike, it seized his free arm and slammed his wrist to the pavement. Marco cried out, couldn't move, as if his entire body had been nailed to the ground. The corpses closed in for the kill. Marco wrestled furiously for his life. He buried his thumb farther into the dead soldier's orbital socket, desperate to pry the corpse away, but it had him pinned, solid, teeth snapping at his neck, inches from his pounding jugular vein. Fire rollicked on the corpse's back. A stink blew from its lips, not breath, but shit-smelling gas forced from the lungs as it slammed Marco against the pavement. Marco gagged, turned his eyes again to the side street. The 4 other corpses were almost on him, 30 feet away. 3 males in torn mechanics coveralls, and a female. No, the corpse with long black hair was male, too. A naked Maricopan, with skin like gray leather, and purple gashes on its stomach. It snarled at Marco. Now 20 feet away. Now less. Marco bucked, whipped his legs, yanked at his trapped arm, tried to roll the corpse sideways. No good. The thing was too goddamn strong, impossible to keep hooked much longer. Marco's thumb trembled, bent backwards. Pain spiked up his wrist. Gonna break? He thought. Fragments of dead skin flaked off the burning corpse's arms and chest, swirled like embers past Marco's face. The flames raged above him, around him. He tasted salt and gasoline on his tongue, his ears filled with the roar of the fire, the hiss of the ruptured engine, the grunts of the monster atop him. It was too much, all of it. For a moment he felt himself lost in the chaos, a sensory overload of smoke and death. Then he blinked, and blinked again. Regained focus. "Screw this," he wheezed. He looked up, and the other corpses had arrived, crawling towards him under the hood of the overturned truck. Hideous faces crusted with old blood, black, gummy drool. Just 5 minutes ago he'd been safe in the Jeep, focused on Danielle. Now he felt a new burning in his eyes, and he battled back tears. Sorry, Dell. He'd always called her Dell. A joke between them. He was too busy for her entire name. Had to be shortened, 1 syllable only. Then off to his next appointment, his next patient. Sorry, Dell. I wanted to find you. But he'd run out of time for her. Again. Frustrated, he screamed with all the air he had left, choked off with a gasp as the burning corpse grabbed his throat, and the 4 other dead males crouched over him, and he wished that the truck's gas tank would just fucking explode now. End him quick. And then a loud whoomp changed everything. It happened fast, confusing him in a dozen ways before he made sense of it. He'd been bracing for the first cold touch of dead fingers, the first agonizing rip of flesh from his body, when suddenly on all sides of him the 4 corpses crashed to the pavement, face-planted and twitching as if they'd been hit with a shovel, all of them at once. Christ, the truck had exploded. No, not exploded, but toppled onto the corpses. No, not the whole truck, just the hood, he realized at last. The heavy hood had popped and swung down hard from above, clubbing the corpses across the backs of their skulls, dropping them. Only the fiery corpse atop Marco had been low enough to escape the blow. Unfazed, it snapped at his shoulder. Marco twisted, avoiding the bite, shocked to be alive still. The scorched green metal hood hung a foot above his head. Then it began to lift, and locked back into place on the truck. What the fuck? Marco craned his neck, trying to get a look up behind him. Around him the corpses struggled to rise, stunned but not finished. At the edge of Marco's vision a figure loomed. Another corpse stooping under the truck, but different somehow, nimble, quick-footed, hopping between the fallen dead men. It leaned in, and Marco flinched, but the hands didn't grab for him. Instead, they struck at the soldier, and, just as quickly, darted away, leaving a white nylon rope strung from the corpse's ankle. And then an even bigger shock. A voice, speaking close behind Marco's ear. "Hold on," it said, a curt command, odd-sounding. "I can't," Marco began. Too late. The pain in his hand boiled over. He gasped as he lost control. His thumb popped from the dead man's socket, and the corpse, now unstoppable, lunged for his neck. But instead it jerked backwards, teeth connecting with nothing. Behind it, Marco saw the rope snap taut, a straight line vanishing from view, dragging the corpse. The huge, dead man launched in reverse, biting at Marco's chest, hips, legs as it went, unable to connect. But at the last moment it lashed out, a strong hand, and caught Marco's boot. "Oh, shit," Marco thought. "Time for a ride." Together they bounced from beneath the truck, and Marco had to contort to avoid a blazing puddle of oil as he and the corpse skidded onto the street. His mind was a daze of fear, relief, adrenaline, bewilderment. His eyes followed the rope. 50 feet away it coiled once around a telegraph pole, and— Holy Jesus goddamn Christ! There was a man, more dreamlike than anything real. A lean, little man, running back towards the truck, the rope slung over his shoulder as he hauled on his makeshift pulley, moving the giant corpse twice his weight. The man pulled even with Marco. He was Asian, young, mid-30s, dressed in military fatigues, soaked with blood around the shoulders and chest. He nodded at Marco, but the gesture was nothing friendly. His eyes were hard and serious. An automatic rifle crossed his back. A thought sped towards Marco's lips. "Use the gun!" But before he could speak, the corpse howled and swiped at the passing man, releasing Marco in the confusion. The man skipped easily over the corpse's swinging arms and continued up the street, still pulling his line. Marco rolled twice and rested on his stomach, panting, his shoulders skinned. The corpse flopped away in the opposite direction, the pavement grating a trail of bad meat from its body. It slammed the telegraph pole where the rope looped, and with a grisly snap, Marco heard, even from a distance, the dead man's knees snapped the wrong way, crumpled around the poles so that its toes flattened against its front thigh. Roaring, it writhed there, broken, sizzling with flame. Marco stared, transfixed. A hand grabbed his shoulder. "Up," said the Asian man beside him again. "Here come more." The 4 fallen corpses had recovered, crawling from beneath the truck. I see them," Marco stammered, his throat hoarse from the flu and the noxious smoke and the stranglehold clamped on him by the soldier corpse. He scrambled to his feet. "No," the man said, "not them." He slapped Marco twice on the back, hard, and pointed at the Silver Dome train depot. "Them!" Dozens of bedraggled corpses flooded through the station doors, across the parking lot. "Oh," Marco said. "Them." Wu was not impressed by Henry Marco. At least not the Henry Marco standing here, half-dazed outside the Maricopa station, a husk of the man Wu had seen in photographs. The intelligence dossier from MSS had included personnel files hacked from the defunct mainframe of St. Joseph's Medical Center. Color photos taken before the resurrection. Dr. Henry Marco, in a white coat, handsome, well-groomed. His eyes had been sharp and intelligent, and on his mouth a reserved smile demonstrated politeness for the camera, nothing more. He had appeared fit, healthy in body and mind. Cunning, the dossier had warned. An adaptive thinker, with strong survival instincts. Wu saw nothing of that now. This Henry Marco was barely more than a corpse himself. Blood and black ash layered his face. Oily sweat streaked his forehead, drawing lines in the ash before dipping into dark hollows under his cheeks. His ribs jutted from his sides. His eyes were tired, unfocused, and he teetered on his heels. This Henry Marco was weak. He would have died if not for Wu's help. Wu frowned. Either MSS had been wrong or the years out in this punishing environment had ruined Marco, depleted his strength and vitality so that now he was nothing. How can the mission possibly need this man? Briefly, he considered putting a bullet in the American now, then setting off to complete the objective on his own, leaving the doctor's bony carcass for the dead to gnaw. But he bristled at the thought of so much wasted effort. The weeks journeying to Arizona, the enormous risks taken to remove the RRU squad and intercept Marco here in Maricopa with the burning truck. And, most important, his orders from MSS were explicit. Get Dr. Henry Marco to Sarsgaard Medical Prison, alive, by force, if necessary. If the primary target, Roger Ballard, wasn't at Sarsgaard as speculated, then Marco's personal knowledge might be critical. Disposing of him here ahead of schedule would be a flagrant disobedience, foolish and dangerous. If for any reason the mission failed and MSS learned Wu had deviated from instructions, he recalled agents he'd known in Beijing, deactivated and convicted of treason, kneeling on their raw knees in concrete rooms, pistols leveled at the backs of their heads. "Let's go," he barked at Marco, frustrated. The corpses from the train station had reached the closest curb, a mob of rancid men in stiff-collared shirts and women in crusted blouses. A blue-uniformed ticket agent missing its lower jaw pushed through the crowd. Its tongue dangled, wriggling like a fat worm. Marco blinked like a man coming out of a trance. "My jeep!" he ordered. The authority in his voice caught Wu off guard, and when Marco turned and bolted, Wu hesitated for the shortest moment, reconsidering. So, perhaps this was the Henry Marco described in the dossier after all. Wu frowned, uncertain about whether the realization pleased him. He bent and grabbed up his day pack where it rested on the pavement, then sprinted after the American. The orange four-wheeler sat lopsided on the next corner, half up the curb. Its bumper crashed into a black trash can. The engine was still running. Without hesitation, Marco ducked into the driver's seat and reached across to throw open the passenger door. Wu dived inside just as the corpses reached the jeep. The dead ticket agent slapped the hood, its tongue bouncing. Marco grabbed the wheel, then let go, hissing. "Fuck," he said, and flexed his hands. His palms were burned and bloodied, sticky-looking. "That hurts." "I can drive," Wu stated. His tone was factual, not sympathetic. "No," Marco said, "you're shotgun." Wu frowned, not understanding. "Shotgun?" "Passenger seat," Marco said, and Wu bristled, feeling the American had read his thoughts too easily. But there was no time for ego as the corpses piled and pressed against the vehicle, and the jeep swayed from one side to the other, then back. The passenger side window was a few centimeters open. Gray fingers waggled through the crack. "Go," Wu said, annoyed. "They'll break in." Marco answered with a gun of the gas pedal, and the jeep squealed, its tires seeking grip on the asphalt. With a shudder it surged from the curb, chucking corpses aside, rolling over others. The ticket agent disappeared underneath, and the cracking of bones played loud in Wu's ears as the jeep gained speed. It broke from the crowd without trouble and hit the street, fishtailing as Marco fought the wheel with his damaged hands. Wu watched him, curious. The American stared ahead, his face scrawled with a pained expression. A sudden roar of sound and light brightened his face, and the jeep rocked. The gas tank of the overturned truck had exploded, a dark red fireball mushrooming from the undercarriage, sweeping the street. The nearest corpses vanished, consumed by the cloud. Others vaulted forward, hit hard by the shock wave. A moment later, the fire collapsed on itself, spitting out corpses that burned like walking torches as they staggered after the jeep. "Shit!" Marco yelled. He wrenched the wheel, and the jeep zigzagged between burning dead men and body parts as if racing a slalom course. Wu slammed twice against the passenger door, grimaced but said nothing. A block later they'd escaped, sailing westward up a side street, past a rickety wooden water tower. Wu observed the receding train depot in his side mirror, the metallic roof shimmering with red heat. Below it on the street, unlucky corpses stood wrapped in shrouds of flame. One by one, they flopped to the ground and grew still, smoldering away to ash. Silently, Wu bid them goodbye. His plan so far had worked, much to his relief. 20 hours ago, back on the mountain trail, he'd stood at his lookout above the Arizona desert, fresh from exterminating the American Special Forces team. A few meters behind him, the paralyzed black soldier screamed pitifully as the old female corpse peeled apart the man's face. Wu concentrated, blocking out the screams. His rifle weighed heavy on his back, as did his conscience. A single bullet could end the man's suffering. But Wu needed the resurrection to saturate the bloodstream, pumped by a beating heart. A quick death would not work, and so Wu waited, patient, preparing his next move. Defeating the Americans had been a clever use of force, but Henry Marco would require more. Wu had paused then, noticing a sudden silence in the mountain air. The soldier had gone quiet, dead, and only the moist smacking of the elderly female's mouth persisted. If the man's body was not consumed entirely, he would resurrect in any time from minutes to hours. It varied, based on some unknown variable between individuals. Blood type, immune system, metabolism. Scientists had not yet unlocked the secrets, but one thing was known. The dead repopulated by stealing numbers from the living. The old corpse, while alive, had likely been a mother, perhaps a grandmother. Now resurrected, the female would be a mother again, this time reproducing in a manner that defiled nature, which was exactly what Wu's plan required. With ease he'd rolled the frail female aside with his foot, sending it down the embankment into a nest of saguaro bush. It stuck there, wailing. Dragging the soldier was harder. The man was large, nearly twice Wu's weight. He grabbed the man's ankle and heaved. The big bodies scraped a few feet along the trail. At least they'd be going down the mountain. He'd dragged the man a dozen meters before he realized what his plan was missing. Idiot. With a scowl, he looked behind himself towards the encampment. He had to go back. Cautiously, he'd climbed the slope, poked his head over the low-lying rocks. The camp was a slaughterhouse. Blood and innards and glistening flanks of fat and meat spread along the red clay of the mountain. 10 or so corpses squatted around the dead Americans. Nelson, Guerrero, Pazzo, he remembered. But to Wu's good fortune, the headless, gray-bearded sergeant lay off to the side, unattended. Wu crept into the clearing, keeping close to the rock wall. The corpses didn't look up, lost in their own racket of crunching bones, snapping tendons, slurping juices. Wu held his breath. Gingerly, he rolled the sergeant's body to the edge of the plateau and dumped him over. The corpses didn't seem to hear. Down below, Wu had worked with haste. He switched into the sergeant's blood-stained uniform, at the same time alert for the slightest twitch of the black soldier's motionless body. What would he do if the big man leapt up, snarling? But his luck held. 3 hours later, he had the soldiers strapped safely into the passenger seat of the American 7-ton truck. The man had resurrected soon after. Its one remaining eye sprang open, hungry and wild, as the big muscles thrashed uselessly against the seatbelt, the broken body unable to move from the waist down, its hands tied with rope. With the captured corpse, Wu drove to the address he'd located in his droid GPS, Henry Marco's house. From a hidden driveway up the road he'd spied on the home. It was sprawling, once lavish and proud, a rich American home, Wu thought with disdain, but all beauty had since faded, and the castle had been transformed into something resembling a junkyard, with vast walls of rubbish and scrap metal. As Wu waited, the sun set. He spent a sleepless overnight in the truck. Beside him in the dark, the dead soldier grunted and hissed, and the truck cab filled with the ripe stink of flesh and gas. Even the open windows did little to diffuse it. "I'm sorry," Wu confided to the corpse. Baines, its name had been. Guilt beat like a second heart in Wu's chest. "I mean you, no dishonor." The Baines corpse growled and chattered its teeth. "It must be done," Wu explained. Bao Ji would not approve, he thought. Bao Ji, his uncle. Wu rubbed his bloodshot eyes, freshening them. "Thank you," he told Baines, and then did not speak again for the remainder of the night. In the morning he'd snapped fully alert when Marco had departed the house. Driving behind at a safe distance, Wu had followed the American doctor to Maricopa. But when Marco's jeep had unexpectedly departed the train station without waiting, Wu paled, worried he'd lost his chance. Thinking fast, he doused the front seat of the truck with lighter fluid and lit it. Cut Baines free with a quick snap of his knife, then pointed the truck at the train station and bailed out through the door. Crash, flames, Marco to the rescue. The action had escalated far more alarmingly than Wu intended. His impulsive fire-setting had endangered the American, and what had been meant as a distraction to gain trust became a near-fatal error when the doctor crawled under the truck. But Wu had corrected the mistake. The two men were now traveling together. With no more corpses in sight, the jeep slowed and followed the avenue, running parallel to the train tracks. Marco whistled, a hollow sound, and his jaw relaxed. He nudged his knees against the steering wheel to hold it in place, then uncurled his hands. "Son of a bitch, that stings!" Wu surveyed the jeep. Supplies and gear littered the floor and seats. He kicked aside a flashlight that had rolled up against his ankle, then cleared aside a few crinkling maps. "Is there a med kit in this mess?" he asked with disapproval. Marco threw him a look. "Yeah, somewhere. A gun, too." "Somewhere," Wu mocked. "Wonderful. Perhaps I'm sitting on it." Marco glanced into the rear mirror and squeezed the brake. The jeep rolled to a stop, half a kilometer from where they'd begun. The scream of the fire had vanished, and only the rumbling engine remained. Marco slapped the jeep in park, then turned in his seat to face Wu. "So," he said, "I assume you're my military escort." Wu's eyes hardened as he stared back at the American. "Yes, I am." "Gen Wo Tzu," Wu thought. "Come with me." Marco cast a sarcastic smile at the soldier next to him in the jeep. "So you're the army," he observed. "I thought there'd be more of you." "Be glad there was me," the man answered dryly, "or you'd be dead." "True. Or then again I'd be on my way to California right now, happily by myself, if you hadn't come along and crashed your fucking truck." The man glared at Marco, jaw tensed, but he said nothing. "So what happened?" Marco prompted. "We were attacked." "Ah, and you weren't prepared for that?" God bless the military. The soldier's eyes sharpened over his high cheekbones. His eyes were green and unusual, a contradiction to his otherwise Asian features. Marco had never seen such a combination. "You listen," the man instructed. "My team is dead because of orders to help you." His speech was unaccented, indistinguishable by dialect. "You'll show respect." Marco blushed. He knew he was being an asshole, for no good reason other than his contempt for Director Owen Osborne. Contempt for this entire damn job. But lashing out at the soldier wasn't fair, especially now after the man had just risked his life for him. "Okay," Marco said, exhaling. "You're right. Sorry, and I'm sorry for your, team, too." He fumbled, not sure what else to say. "Thanks for saving my ass," he added. The soldier studied him, then leaned back against the seat, seemingly pacified. "Don't thank me. Thank DHS. We wanted to go without you." "Sounds familiar?" Marco quipped. He regarded the soldier's dusty brown uniform. The shoulders and chest were caked dark with blood. The soldier read his look. "Not mine," he stated. "Baines. Your wrestling partner back there in the truck. Bled out on me." "So what happened?" Marco asked again. The soldier shrugged. "We were up in Lost Dutchman, running recon on your house. At sunup this morning, a pack of Zoms ambushed our camp. Corpses. Baines and Pazzo had watch. They whooped us awake, but too late. I heard crashing, sat up and saw a corpse crawling through the tent flap. I flipped a blanket over its head and escaped out the back." He swallowed. Outside, Baines was down, being chewed. Pazzo was already torn apart. 20, 30 corpses. I grabbed the guns and ran to Baines, kicked the corpse off and got him up. Guerrero, my rifleman, came charging, firing, bullets kicking off rocks. A miracle he didn't shoot me. Then he was piled on and went down screaming. Nothing I could do. Hard enough just keeping Baines on his feet. I didn't see anyone else. But Nelson's tent was shaking. He was screaming, too. The soldier trailed off, as if contemplating some private thought. "You got Baines out," Marco said. The man nodded slowly. "Yes, propped him up. Pulled back down the trail. Luckily the dead didn't follow. They had enough. I escorted Baines to the truck, bleeding bad. But I thought—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know what I thought." "He couldn't have made it," Marco said, trying to help. "Not after he was bitten." "I know that," the soldier said. "But I couldn't leave him. So you drove him here. Had to catch up to you. Baines resurrected before I even knew he was dead. I wasn't thinking. I should have stowed him in the back, but I had him up in the passenger seat so I could talk to him, maybe keep him focused. We were doing 80 just outside town. Suddenly he grabs for me and tries to take a bite. I barely held him off. Baines was big." "I noticed." The soldier continued in a flat voice. "I pulled my pistol, but he knocked my hand and the shot hit the dash. Must have punched the engine, caught the oil. Before I knew it, the truck was on fire, with a giant corpse all over me. I managed to stop the brake once or twice, then got my hand to the door latch and popped it. Bailed out backwards. Almost broke my spine rolling on the road. The truck went another 100 feet and crashed, and that's where you joined the party." Marco studied him, perplexed. Throughout the retelling of the team's death, the man had seemed curiously untouched. Maybe he was a tough bastard, burying his emotions, or maybe he had no grief to hide. Indeed, there was an air of cold functionality about him, like a decision-maker who operated by logic rather than heart. He was small, slighter than a normal RRU soldier, the complete opposite of Baines. But his eyes were striking and fearless. Intelligent. In the silence, Marco sensed 1,000 calculations taking place behind each intense green iris. And that's when Marco realized the soldier was measuring him as well. A chill rippled through him. A hunch that the man was holding something back. Well, no shit. Of course he's holding back. God knows his exact orders, or what Osborn told him about me, about Roger. So be careful, Marco reminded himself. Wait and see before you get too chummy. He almost flinched when the soldier extended his right hand, blood-smudged and gritty. "Ken Wu," the man said. "Sergeant First Class, RRU." Beneath the gore on the man's uniform, a military patch was just discernible. 3 pointed gold stripes above, 2 rounded stripes below. Marco nodded and shook the outstretched hand. "Henry Marco here," he said, forcing a smile. "I guess you knew that, right?" The soldier, Wu, did not return the smile. "I've been briefed." "Yeah. Well, I hope your brief was more informative than mine." Wu frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning, what the hell are we doing?" "I was told that you'd been apprised of the target." Marco scoffed. "Target?" "Yes, Roger Ballard. A friend of mine, by the way. But I'm sure your director told you that. You and the target were co-workers, yes." "Jesus, stop calling him that." "Ballard." "Yes, Ballard," Marco sighed. "We worked at the hospital." The comment seemed to interest Wu. "And how did—" "Shit," Marco interrupted. In the rearview mirror he'd seen motion. 7 or 8 corpses had caught up from the train station, lurching doggedly towards the jeep from a block away. A dead male in a business suit led the crowd, smoke wafting from its jacket. It dragged its foot sideways, broken at the ankle. "We have to get going," Marco said. Wu twisted around in his seat. "I agree." "Great," Marco said wryly. "Your approval means everything." He popped the gear into drive and the jeep rumbled forward. Wu sat silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "This is a military operation, Doctor. Remember that." Marco drew a deep breath, his forehead burning as if he were still under the fiery truck. Fucker. He could tell he was going to hate this. For the past 4 years, every decision had been his own, nobody to approve or say otherwise. But now this. Wu, Osborn, the United States fucking government telling him what to do, running his ass from here to California. I was better off alone, he seethed. But then another thought whispered in his head, quietly, almost sadly. Hey, buddy, you going to be ready for society if they ever let you back? Or have you been alone out here too long? The thought sobered him. All right, then, he said, swallowing his anger. The jeep sailed up the street, heading west, the early sun behind them. Racing them to the left were the railroad tracks, bound off by a chain-link fence. Marco eyed a crossing 1 block ahead. California, here we come. Right back where I started from, he thought. I have a GPS, Wu began. Don't need it, Marco said, and swerved the jeep through a gap in the fence. The vehicle skidded across a narrow bed of gravel, jounced twice very hard, sending both men briefly airborne, supplies flying, and smacked down onto the westward train tracks. Marco shot Wu a devilish grin. I know the way there. Just don't ask me if I know the way home. Chapter 6. Dead Man's Switch. Hours had passed, and the sun had climbed from behind the jeep to a point high above, and then gradually nosed ahead as Marco drove west along the tracks out of Maricopa. Progress was slow, 20 miles an hour tops. The terrain beside the tracks was frequently undrivable, extreme with rocks and abrupt hazardous ditches, and Marco often had no choice but to steer directly onto the railway. The haggard wooden ties pummeled the jeep from below. Every few minutes a tire swerved against the rail. and the men banged sideways in their seats. On the passenger side, Wu scowled, massaging his temple. "Headache?" Marco asked. "I'm fine," Wu replied. He blinked and concentrated straight ahead. Marco suppressed a grin. A long drive on the tracks was punishment on the body, the constant shock waves hammering bones and sinew. Wu had no idea how sore he'd be tomorrow. "Sure," Marco said. His own neck was knotted tight. His entire frame throbbed with various degrees of pain, from the dull bruising in his legs where the giant corpse had fallen on him, to the sting in his burned hands, to the dry itch of his smoke-irritated eyes. "I'm fine, too." They were crossing the hottest corner of Arizona, the Sonoran Desert. Around them sprawled harsh, waterless miles, tangled with prickly pear and burrowweed. No human population. No corpses, thank God, just rattlesnakes, tarantulas, even jaguars farther southwest. Distant brown mountains caged them in. By mid-afternoon, the dashboard thermometer read 110 outside, and even with the windows rolled up and the AC cooling, the Jeep felt stuffy, brooding with an atmosphere of sweat and unspoken worry. The sun proved unstoppable. It reached through the windshield and pressed its hot hands on Marco's forehead. Ahead of the Jeep, a speckled iguana skidded across the tracks and disappeared into a scramble of red rocks. Wu turned his head to follow it. "That would have made a good meal," he remarked. "How are you for rations?" Marco gestured to the back seat. "Jerky, water, MREs I grabbed from abandoned army trucks. Plenty for me. I'll share, but I wasn't planning on a dinner guest." "I don't need your help." The condescension in the soldier's voice was obvious. Marco bristled. "Fine, asshole. Go hunt a fucking lizard." Wu seemed oblivious to the insult he'd caused. He turned from the window and cracked his neck with a spiritless motion, to the left, then to the right. "How far are we?" he asked. Grudgingly, Marco returned his attention to the tracks. Far ahead, the heated desert seemed to warp the rails and melt them into shimmering air. Beyond the window to his left lay miles of rippled sand dunes. Saguaro cactus towered taller than telephone poles, ending where the horizon erupted into the Gila Mountains, a row of rough summits. They'd passed through the Gila Bend station about an hour ago. Marco had eyed the concrete platform with distrust, but, to his relief, nothing crawled from the overhang to intercept them, and the Jeep rolled through without incident. "Probably close to Yuma," he guessed now. He'd already reviewed the intended route with Wu, popping open the glove compartment a few miles past Maricopa to tug out a collection of railway maps. He'd handed Wu the thick, rubber-banded stack and tapped a creased yellow brochure on top. Sunset Limited, it read. This was the Amtrak line running westward into Yuma, then across the Arizona border and up through California. Marco had shown Wu where they'd ditched the tracks just past San Bernardino, then backroad the remaining miles to Sarsgaard. Wu had given the map a cursory scan. "Agreed," was his only comment, spoken in a tone that suggested he would have chosen differently if he'd been consulted sooner. He returned the stack to the glove compartment and snapped the latch shut. They drove on, mostly in silence. Marco wasn't yet sure what to make of Wu. The sergeant hadn't said much since leaving Maricopa, busying himself instead with returning Marco's spilled gear to its proper storage. "Your weapon," he'd observed once, chidingly, then reached down between the seats to retrieve the lost Glock. He'd hung the gun in its holster on the neck rest behind Marco. For miles afterwards he'd stared forward through the windshield, as if in a trance, back straight, hands on his knees, inhaling deeply through rounded nostrils. On the back seat rested his army day pack, beaten and brown, with a single shoulder sling. Strapped to the side were 2 scary-looking knives, curled like half-circles, with the handle in the center. "Cool knives," Marco offered. "I'm guessing those aren't standard army issue." "I brought my own," the sergeant said without looking. "Out here, we're allowed to embellish." His lips pressed tight together, signaling lack of interest in the conversation. "Well, I like 'em. Maybe for my birthday I'll get me a pair." Marco stole a sideways glance. On Wu's left cheek, a shiny bruise had blossomed, glazing the skin from his jawbone to his ear. Evident in the middle were white knuckle marks. He'd been punched recently. Hard. Marco frowned. Punched by who? Wu hadn't mentioned it. Only his struggle with the dead man, Baines. Guess Baines gave him a good whack. Again a thought stirred in Marco's head that Wu wasn't telling him everything. Crap. He hated to admit it, but Wu made him uneasy, a discomfort that went beyond the natural awkwardness between a soldier and a civilian. Sitting there in silence, Wu gave the eerie impression of a jack-in-the-box, placid and uneventful, baiting you to turn the handle. Nothing happens except you feel a little more tension, and then you keep turning and turning until... Marco sighed, loosened his grip on the steering wheel. Fine, fuck him then, Marco thought. And fuck Osborne, too. That new Republican asshole. Whatever was on the secret agenda of these 2 dickheads, all that mattered to Marco was returning Roger, then getting the hell home. Alive. With all his body parts still attached. So, let Wu think I'm incompetent, or a jerk, or a hindrance to the mission, or all of the above. Don't matter to me. Marco knew better. Give it a day, and I'll be the one saving his ass. He noticed Wu watching him with interest. Quickly, he erased the scowl that had crept onto his lips. Poker face, Henry, he thought. Definitely close to human now, he said, conscious of the flush in his throat, and pointed off to the right, eager to draw Wu's green eyes off him. Those mountains there are the Harkivars. Fortuna Foothills is right under. Nice place to live. Not at present, Wu observed. Marco ignored him, contemplating the dry brown peaks instead. A memory popped into his head, surprising him. First time I ever saw Arizona, he said. These mountains made me think of that old Hemingway story. The title, Hills Like White Elephants. Except here the hills are like big golden cats. See what I mean? Cats, crouched down, with giant, muscular shoulders, like they're ready to pounce. And we're just squeaky little rodents. Nostalgia tugged at him, and he remembered more. We nearly bought a house here, in Fortuna. For a moment he actually lost track of himself, forgot why he was here now, forgot that it was Wu sitting next to him. He felt good, just talking. Not about corpses, not about contracts, just shooting the shit. He almost laughed when he realized he was making small talk. So, where are you from? He asked Wu. Before all this, I mean. Wu's gaze seemed to scale the Harkivars, disappear into the mountains. The corner of his mouth twitched. Far, he said with a hint of regret. He paused. Boston. Miss it? The sergeant's expression went cold again. No. Marco sniffed. Geez, sorry. Didn't mean to get personal. He let a few awkward seconds pass, then tried again, not ready to let go of his remembrance. Anyway, Arizona takes some getting used to, but it's beautiful in its own brown, rocky way. I guess out here you really feel like you're someplace different, I don't know, than wherever you came from, which can be a good thing. We ended up picking a house over in the Gold Canyon. Man, what a view. Not like L.A. at all. The Superstition Mountains were practically our backyard. Ironic, Danielle had said. You living here, the least superstitious man I've ever met. Wu answered only with a dismissive nod. His focus had settled again on Marco. Tell me, he said, his voice serious, all business, about Roger Ballard. Marco's neck knotted tighter. Small talk was officially over. The question about Roger had slapped Marco out of his reverie, kicked him back to the present. Danielle was gone again. The jeep crunched through a patch of spiny Ocotillo plants, and he tugged the wheel back onto the tracks. Wu eyed him expectantly. Roger? Marco said, clearing his head. Oh. The resentment he'd felt minutes earlier returned in force. He didn't feel like discussing Roger. Screw it, he thought. Wu and Osborne are keeping secrets. Why can't I? Go ask your boss, he answered. Osborne knows everything. Wu considered this. I see you're reluctant to share, but the answer could be useful. Useful. Osborne had chosen the same word yesterday to describe Marco. Again, Marco rankled at the idea, himself a tool in another person's hands, doing their work. Wu seemed to read his thoughts. I hope you realize I'm in the same position as you, Doctor. I'm NCO, non-commissioned officer, meaning I have no top-level intelligence. If you think I know all the tricks of this mission, I don't. I'm just a bullet fired from a gun, same as you. We don't decide the direction or the target, or know why the trigger was pulled. We just go and hit something. Personally, I'd prefer to know more about what we're hitting. About Ballard. Wu stopped. Bumps of sweat dappled his forehead. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, then fanned his fingers before the air-conditioning vent. From what I can tell, Doctor, we both feel saddled with an unnecessary partner. But I think we underestimate each other. I do know that Uncle Owen considered you a highly skilled individual. Marco blinked. Uncle? Director Osborne, Wu clarified. No relation to me. Uncle Owen is simply Osborne's nickname in the media. You don't follow the news? I've been a little out of touch lately, so why Uncle? A reference to Uncle Sam, I suppose. The face of American bravado. A patriotic icon protecting the nation's interests. Marco laughed, a sharp bark. The jeep rattled over a gap where 4 or 5 rail ties had torn loose from the tracks. Yeah, perfect. That ugly piranha on a poster. I want you. He grinned, was surprised to find Wu stone-faced next to him. He'd sensed a bit of fun in the banter, as if perhaps the sergeant were finally warming up, but clearly not. The sergeant's frosty green eyes regarded him, unblinking. Right, Marco said, uncertain. He coughed and cleared his throat. But I still don't understand. Why is Osborne an icon? Osborne was head of Homeland Security at the time of the resurrection. More or less, he founded the New Republican movement the year afterwards, deflected all the blame onto President Garrett. Got Hoff elected with all his bluster and finger-pointing, and on top of all that, the evacuation was Osborne's idea. The safe states are his brainchild. In his head, Marco heard echoes of New Republican speeches, hot with vitriol and threats, pushing laws through a weakened Congress. Without a vaccine for the resurrection, they railed, the West is lost, poisoned beyond hope. The evacuated states will remain closed. The safe states are America's future. Let us protect you. Give us power. Stay afraid. Just then the sergeant cut off Marco's thoughts. "So," Wu said, "Roger Ballard." Marco scowled. "Jesus, you don't give up, do you? I'd rather talk politics." Wu fixed Marco with a grim look. "Dr. Marco, any mission can succeed or fail on the basis of a single detail. As a doctor, I think you'd agree. Would you operate without first demanding to know each symptom, no matter how small it might seem?" Marco grimaced. "All right, I get where you're going. You value details as much as I do. So tell me about Ballard, and I'll tell you what I do know about our mission. Is that fair?" "Depends who goes first. Are we using the honor system?" "Honor is everything to me." "Right. Death before dishonor. All that. Careful what you wish for." Marco ran his tongue along his teeth. The talking had dried his gums. He reached between his feet for his canteen and guzzled a swig. He badly wanted to pour the water over his scalp, rub it through his grungy hair, but instead he offered the canteen to Wu. The sergeant declined with a slight shake of his head. Marco recapped the water and returned it to the shade below the seat. "All right," he declared. "Fair deal. Honor system. I go, then you go. And nobody leaves out any of the interesting details." "Agreed." "Good. Now, the truth is you might be getting the worse end of the bargain. I don't really have a lot to tell about Roger." "But you did know him." "Yeah," Marco conceded. "I knew him. We were both on staff at Cedars-Sinai, the hospital in Los Angeles. I was in the neurology department. You probably knew that already. And Roger was in encephalopathy. You probably know that, too." "He was a brain doctor," Wu said. "Brain disorders. Diseases." "How long did you work together?" Let's see. Roger began at Cedars-Sinai. Marco squinted, as if he could see through time. It had been the year he'd married Danielle, and the year his mother had died. "In 2010, he finished. "Then I left for Arizona in 2013, so 3 years. Wu's lips pressed together. He appeared focused. Marco imagined this new data being logged somewhere in the man's mind for later analysis. "And you were friends?" Wu asked. Marco stiffened. He shifted in his seat and checked the rearview mirror. Old driving habits were hard to break. Nothing to see behind the Jeep but endless scrub and train tracks. He sighed. "Friends. Yeah, in a way, I guess. Back at the start." "The start?" "The start of his residency, yeah. We were both from the East. Me, Cornell, and him, Yale. People said he was kind of a prick. I don't know, we got along. He was actually a lot like me, but a more extreme version. He was me in a funhouse mirror. You know, distorted. Everything more out of whack. I've never been that great with people, but Roger, he was practically a hermit. He had no family, kept to himself. He was smarter than me, too, smart as hell, and in a way that was maybe his problem. The human brain absolutely mesmerized him. What made it go, or what made it stop, but never the human. If you asked him about a diagnosis, he'd talk you under the table, but ask how his weekend went, and you'd get nothing. 1 or 2 words. 3, if it was a long weekend. He wasn't being a dick, he just didn't think it mattered. "But he considered you a friend?" Marco shrugged. "I don't know. Respected me, I guess. Judged me as competent. In Roger's mind, that qualified as friendship. And I'm no chatterbox either. So, probably he was more comfortable around me than other people. Like I said, we got along." "Yes, at the start, you said," Wu observed. "But not the end." The Jeep had crossed another 4 miles of the Sonoran, and on the north edge of the desert, a miniature display of buildings and homes and a trailer park now dotted the landscape. Yuma, far ahead. To either side of the tracks, the desert tilted at steep angles. Marco centered the jeep and eased off the gas. The vehicle slowed and bounced with greater deliberation. Marco felt his head lighten. He remembered his last day at Cedars-Sinai. "Goodbye, Henry," Roger had said. And Marco had ignored him. Kept walking. Dizzy, Marco gripped the wheel tighter. His hands hurt, the burns still raw, but at least the pain anchored him. Jesus, the ride was making him nuts. He waited another few moments, allowing the weight of his body to return before answering Wu. "No, not at the end," he admitted. "By the time I left, not at all." "And why was that?" "Because—" Marco began. He stopped. His tongue seemed to slide backwards into his throat. "Things got different," he continued self-consciously, feeling his ears burn. "Roger got different. Moodier all the time, more withdrawn, like he'd gone deeper into his own dark cave. You'd see him in the hall or the cafeteria looking very preoccupied, and his eyes would just glance off you like you didn't even register. Even me. He'd walk by and not say hello. And neither would I," he added silently. "Why did you leave?" Wu asked. Marco shot him a guarded glance. How much did the sergeant know already? But Wu's countenance was blank, implying nothing. "I had a great opportunity in Arizona," Marco answered, "at St. Joseph's." Roger Ballard appeared in his mind. The bony, rectangular face, prematurely wrinkled, wire-frame glasses not big enough to hide the heavy dark bags under his eyes. Thick, brown hair combed straight back in his head. Sallow cheeks tapering to a narrow chin, and his top lip not quite centered, formed just a bit to the left like a permanent sneer. Whispering something. One creepy thing, Marco remembered. He mumbled to himself a lot near the end. You'd see him at his desk, his lips moving, but he wasn't talking to you. Talking to himself. Odd. Marco nodded. Rumors started around, like maybe he was having a problem, drinking, or some drug, because, well, here's what you need to know about Roger. What pushed him over the edge, I think. Marco's mouth was dry again. Something bad had happened. Wu cocked his head, interested. Bad? To Ballard? Well, bad to a patient. But it affected Roger. People said it was his fault. Marco took a deep breath and steeled himself. Say it. A baby died. Wu's eyes narrowed. Hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, Marco continued, the words turning over in his stomach. Birth asphyxia. Not enough oxygen to the brain. Look! Wu interrupted. He pointed through the windshield. Ahead on the tracks! Marco snapped up straight in his seat. Shit! He said, and hit the brake. A silent, unmoving train blocked the tracks, lifeless and weathered like the cast-off skin of a snake. 100 yards long, 11 cars connected. Far ahead, a Titanic locomotive rested on a curve in the rails. Faded pink and green stripes ran the length of the cars, powdered with wind-blown dirt. Grime covered the windows. Marco crept the jeep to a stop 50 feet behind the last car. He let the engine idle as he contemplated the dead train. It's the Sunset Limited, he said. Wu scratched the back of his head. How far from the next station? Yuma. Not that far. Any reason a train would stop here? No, Marco replied. Only bad reasons. Wu rolled down his window and listened to the desert. "Seems quiet," he observed. Neither man spoke. Wu was right. Outside, the Sonoran napped through the angry heat of daytime, nothing but the churning of desert bees and the faraway call, "Kiu, kiu, kiu, kiu," of a Hilo woodpecker, nesting somewhere in the shade of a cactus. Half a minute passed, then Wu asked, "Does it have a dining car?" Marco frowned. "The Sunset? Sure, they all—" He stopped mid-sentence, understanding Wu's interest. Immediately he regretted his answer. Too late. Wu nodded and opened his door. "Wait," Marco said, disapproving. "What are you doing?" "Getting a look." Wu swung himself out of the Jeep and reached into the back seat. "I assume this train wasn't empty when it left Gila River." "Safe assumption," Marco grumbled. Both his hands remained on the steering wheel. "The Sunset holds 200 passengers, I bet. Probably 250, plus the crew." "I see." Wu pulled his day pack and the AK from the back. He untied the knives and hooked them to his belt, then slipped the gun strap over his shoulder. Marco tensed. The hum of the Jeep trembled up his legs, begging him to drive. "Hold on," he protested. "Just get back in, we'll go round it." Wu leaned through the passenger door, shook his head. "You have your rations, Doctor. Here's where I get mine. But I'm not reckless. We'll do a quick recon. If it's clear, and only if it's clear, we can raid that dining car's galley, in and out in 3 minutes, loaded with enough food to last us both the next week. Or would you rather risk a supermarket in the middle of the next town? How many corpses in Yuma? More than 200, I'm certain." Marco opened his mouth, but had no answer. Wu's point was valid. The supplies in the Jeep would take them halfway only. When those ran out, they'd have to replenish somewhere. At least out here, the train was remote, much safer than a trip into town. "You're wasting time, Doctor," Wu continued. "If there are corpses on that train, we should make our move before they know we're here, in case they're as hungry as we are." "Funny," Marco said. "Look, some advice. There's no such thing as easy around here. I'm talking from experience. 1 minute seems fine, the next is all out fucked. These corpses have a way of— I know this sounds crazy, but a way of outwitting you. Maybe because we overthink, and they just go on instinct. But I've seen some very smart people get their heads torn off because they underestimated a few rotting bodies." He hesitated. "Your unit, for example." Wu's face darkened. Marco reconsidered. "I'm sorry," he admitted. "That came out harsh. I appreciate the honesty. Believe it or not, I don't want you to die a horrible death." Wu said nothing, simply stood and adjusted the rifle on his back. He left the Jeep and trotted 4 or 5 steps towards the tail of the train. "Let's go!" he called back over his shoulder. "Shit," Marco thought, relenting. Okay, then. He wouldn't let Wu risk it alone. However arrogant the man might be, however strange, however huge a dickhead, he'd been a lifesaver back at Maricopa. Wu was fearless, no doubt, a definite big-time ass-kicker. The video of Sarsgaard prison flashed in Marco's memory. 1,000 blood-soaked corpses, wild and rioting. He shuddered. The truth was, he was going to need Wu's help at Sarsgaard, and right now, Wu needed his, whether the soldier wanted to admit it or not. We don't have to be best buddies, Marco thought. But Jesus, we ought to stick together. Marco tapped the gas and rolled the Jeep forward, pulling next to Wu. Hey! Marco called through the open window. All right, you win, I'm coming with you. Leave the Jeep! Wu said curtly and continued walking. Marco rolled his eyes. Holy Christ, it's hard to be nice to you. Stop acting like a teenage girl on a hissy fit for a goddamn second and listen to me. Wu halted. He turned and regarded Marco with skepticism. "Just get in," Marco said. "We'll drive up next to the dining car and leave the Jeep there. Engine on, ready to drive. No sense parking this far back." Wu considered, then a moment later nodded. "Agreed," he said, opening the door and climbed back into the passenger seat. Carefully, Marco steered the Jeep off the tracks and onto the sloping desert terrain. The Jeep dipped to the right, and Marco heard his bag of gear slide across the back seat. Wu pressed his hands against the dashboard, steadying himself. The Jeep crawled alongside the train. Each dark car was massive, the size of a house. The rear car was a double-level sleeper. Centered in the middle was an open doorway through which Marco saw metal stairs ascending into shadow. He kept his boots steady on the gas pedal, and the Jeep passed the opening with no protest from Wu. At least he's got some sense, Marco thought. Entering the train at the tail end, walking up tight-quartered passenger cars to the diner would be way the hell too risky, and Marco wasn't feeling quite that suicidal. Not today, anyway. The Jeep continued past a windowless baggage car, and beyond that were 4 metal-ribbed coaches lined with portholes of dirt-caked glass. Something moved. Through the grime of one window, a flash of white skin, then darkness. "Ah, shit," Marco said, craning his neck. "Did you see that?" Wu nodded. "We won't go near that car. The diner is up ahead." "You said only if it was clear." "That didn't look clear." The Jeep pulled even with the impressive lounge car. The vessel loomed above them. Marco watched it creep past. 11 dark windows staring back at him like a set of alien eyes. Thick observation glass rounded the upper deck, designed to give riders an unobstructed view of California mountains and sparkling stars on desert nights. All wasted now. Even from below, Marco could see streaks and spatters of what looked like dried black mud on the skylight glass. Except it wasn't mud. "There's guts everywhere," he announced. The dining car rattled up beside them. "Stop the Jeep," Wu said. "We go in here." Marco winced at the crunch of rusted metal. In the quiet desert, each sound seemed 100 decibels louder, a screaming wake-up call to every possible corpse on the train. Jesus Christ, this is stupid. He held his breath and wedged the crowbar deeper between the black panels that connected the lounge and the dining car, bending the material apart. The diner had no exterior doors, so breaking into the small walkway between cars was the simplest way inside. Marco had volunteered for the job, attacking the lower corner, the only area he could reach. The corridor was raised 10 feet off the ground, joining the upper levels of the train. He'd hoisted himself up by the outer grab rails and established an unsteady foothold along a rubber-tubed electrical cable. From this awkward perch, he could barely get leverage on the crowbar. The iron handle pushed back at him, almost chucked him to the dirt below. "Do it fast," Wu ordered. He sounded annoyed. "Slow makes more noise." "So does talking," Marco snapped. "Shut up, please." He rocked the crowbar back and forth into the seam where the paneling bolted to the car. His grip was painful. On the 4th or 5th pull, he felt the burn blisters on his palms pop, and a watery serum leaked between his fingers. "Motherfucker," he hissed to himself. The paneling shook and bounced to the sound of loose chains jangling. Drops of his sweat splashed the metal, drawing dark, wet spots in the dust. And then, at last, the paneling peeled apart with another hideous squeal. A narrow shadow opened, large enough to fit through. "There," Marco breathed. Exhausted, he hopped down. "We're in." "Not yet," Wu said. "There's still the diner door inside." 20 feet behind them, the Jeep idled on a sandy dune where the desert dropped off steeply from the tracks. Marco had parked at a precarious tilt, the sand loose beneath the wheels as he fishtailed to a stop. Hurriedly, he armed himself with the Glock. then rummaged in the back for the crowbar and a flashlight, and his duffel bag to cart whatever food they'd find. Might find, he reminded himself. Could be nothing. The more he thought about it, the more this idea sucked. "Hey," he said, turning to Wu, "you ever throw a rock at a hornet's nest?" Wu frowned. He seemed not to understand. Marco continued, "Like when you're a kid, right? You find a hornet's nest, and it's all quiet and peaceful, and for whatever idiot reason that makes sense to a kid, you throw a rock. And then you better run like hell when 1,000 pissed-off hornets come shooting out to sting your ass to death." Wu stared blankly. Marco sighed. "Right, so maybe we had different childhoods. But my point is, right now we're standing outside a giant, metal, quiet hornet's nest. So before we do this, let's take a second and ask ourselves, are we really sure we want to throw a rock?" Wu considered this. "Doctor," he said, "were you ever stung?" "Well, no, I always got away." "Exactly," Wu said. "So do I." The matter apparently settled, he grabbed a handrail and, with graceful ease, weightless, deft like an acrobat, each limb in perfect sync with the others, scaled the train exterior and slithered his upper body into the torn panel. For a moment his legs hung from the hole, and then he kicked, and the darkness swallowed him. Marco tensed, waiting. Then he saw the flashlight click on. Wu's voice, muffled, called to him, "Clear! Come on!" Marco set the crowbar down, then reconsidered and picked it up again. With the Glock holstered and the crowbar tucked under his arm, he climbed, not like Wu at all, clumsily, banging his ribs as he flopped and wriggled his way into the crack. God damn it, no style points there, he thought, rolling onto his back. Inside, the atmosphere was cooler, out of the sun, but musty and oxygen-depleted. Marco battled the urge to stick his head outside again for a fresh gulp of air. Instead, he blinked, his eyes adjusting, the afternoon still bright on his retinas. He rose to his feet and bumped against Wu, who stood sweeping the flashlight high and low, measuring the space they'd entered. The short connector was about 3 feet long, just enough for both men to fit shoulder to shoulder. Dust hovered in the flashlight beam, and ghostly spiderwebs laced the corners. Seed shells littered the floor around a ball of dry leaves where some desert mouse had once nested. Wu cast the light over Marco's shoulder. "That's it," he said. "This way." Behind Marco was a closed metal door, a window in the middle. The flashlight's reflection in the glass burned like a sun in a starless universe. A small placard read, "Dining car," in dirty red letters. Next to it sat a large rectangular button. Press. The door had been hydraulic. Hit the button, the door slid open. Wouldn't work now. "There'll be a release somewhere for emergencies," Marco said, scanning the jams. "Like power failures, or when resurrected corpses eat all the people on board." On the frame above the door he found it, a small inset panel with a sticker, "In case of emergency, open this box. Pull red lever down. Slide door open." Wu leaned across Marco and popped the lid. His hand reached for the lever. "Wait," Marco interrupted. "Let's have a peek first. Turn off the light. There's too much reflection." Wu replied with the slightest of nods, and Marco heard a click. The antechamber fell dark, barely fed by light from the cracked paneling. In another few moments Marco's eyes had once more adjusted. He squinted into the window to the dining car. Even here, inside the train, the grime and debris on the glass were thick, hard to see past. He rubbed his elbow on the glass, then cupped his hands around the cleared swathe and peered again. Still no good. Too much shit on the other side, mucking it up. He had registered a few dark edges of tables. The rest was pure black. He raised a fist and rapped 3 times on the window. Behind him, Wu spoke up. "I thought you said no noise." "If anything's in there, I'd like to know now, before we open the door." They waited. Nothing. "All right, then," Marco said. "Pull that bad boy." Wu yanked the red lever, and the door shuddered once. "Try it." Flushed with sweat, Marco wrestled the crowbar into the padded edge of the doorway. Even unlocked, the door was stingy. Years of caked filth in the runners had almost cemented it shut, but he threw his shoulder against the bar, and the door popped open, too hard, too loud, dirt grinding in its gears. It rattled halfway, then stopped. Marco aimed his Glock into the gap. The stock felt slick in his palm. The darkness seemed alive, grumbling back at him, buzzing. Sounded like... Click! The flashlight leaped on, cutting a beam into the dining car. Flies. Thousands of flies exploding in and out of the light, a repulsive black cloud that swirled and bounced, split in pieces, merged again. Marco flinched. Disgusting. Wu swung the light lower, to the floor. Bodies. The center aisle was a graveyard, a slaughterhouse killing floor of torn human limbs and rib cages and mummified heads with screaming mouths captured in final poses of pain and terror. Men, women, small skeletons too, chiseled with bite marks. Children. 30, 40 people caught here in an attack, making a last stand as corpses overtook the train. Bodies piled in the booths, too, gutted while they'd hidden under tables or struggled to break the windows. "Welcome to the dining car," Wu announced. His voice was unamused. A sludge of blood and offal carpeted the floor, inches thick, but solid, hardened with time. The bodies had been dead for years, dried now and colorless, spines torn apart, brains mashed. These victims had been devoured too quickly, too completely to resurrect. The stench was old, too, a fusty, stomach-turning gas, molecules of dissolved soft tissue bogging down the air. Marco coughed, hit his nose in the crook of his elbow. The sight sickened him, and at the same time propelled his heart faster. "Fuck," he said. "We should go back." "Why? These bodies aren't moving." "Come on, man," Marco urged. "What do you think happened here? Food poisoning? The train must have had its own mini-outbreak. Some passenger with the resurrection punched everybody else's ticket, too. The corpses that did this are someplace on board. Guaranteed." "I understand, Doctor. Thankfully, we only need this one car." "Jesus Christ! How many safety lectures do I have to give you today?" Wu brushed past, knocking Marco's shoulder as he stepped through the doorway into the dining car. The flashlight poked deeper into the darkness, illuminating more ghostly tables, cloaked in gray tablecloths, and a waiter's station halfway up the car. "Wu!" Marco growled. "Get the fuck back! We have to go!" Wu continued forward, stepping over bones. Asshole. Right here was exactly what Marco hated, stupid military bullshit that gets everybody killed. He considered retreating to the jeep, leaving Wu. Just sit out there and wait for the screaming to start. But then what? Rush back to the rescue? Drive away? His neck flushed, ashamed. Don't be a pussy, he thought. He shook his head and sighed. Whatever. I guess this stupid military bullshit is contagious. He flexed his fingers on the crowbar and stepped over the gap in the connector, rolling his eyes at a small white sign. Watch your step. Yeah, tell me about it, he thought. His boot crunched down on the crust of blood in the entryway, and the smell of death thickened. He followed Wu up the car. Around him, 1,000 flies rose and dived, bouncing off his face as he tried to swat them. He clamped his mouth tight to keep them out. He couldn't help but marvel at how long they must have existed here, chewing nests into carcasses. Generations of flies, each surviving days at a time, doing its part, picking the dead clean, laying eggs, dying so the next can be born, repeating over and over, 4 years here in this same train, shut off from the world outside. The first generation had seen the carnage, had feasted on fresh blood and moist, shivering organs, but these flies knew none of that. This is all normal to them, Marco thought, the only life they've known. Hatched into a land of silent bones. How long, he wondered, until it's like that for us? A generation? Nobody'll even remember this planet before the resurrection. Disheartened, he moved carefully, but stumbled once, stepping hard on a brittle femur bone that broke underfoot with a grisly crack. He grabbed hold of a table edge to steady himself, and the stiff fabric of the tablecloth bunched in his fingers. In the dim light he saw a dark blotch on the cloth, an old, bloody handprint, small and female. He fixed his balance and kept moving. Halfway through the car, he caught up to Wu at the counter of the small waiter's station. Wu stood examining a square hole in the wall, about 1.5 feet wide. He shone the flashlight in. A narrow shaft dropped straight down. "Dumb waiter," Wu said, "for sending up food. The kitchen's below us." "Don't tell me. We're going to slide down it." Wu shot him a quizzical look. "If you'd like, Doctor. I'll use the staircase there." He gestured with the flashlight to a small flight of steps beyond the counter. Wise ass. "Well, I'm glad you have at least some common sense." He stopped, snapped his head to the left, squinted towards the far end of the car. "What?" Wu asked. "Shh." Marco frowned and pointed up the aisle. "Shine the light." Wu turned the beam. The door at the other end was open. A petrified mess of human forms lay sprawled in the doorway, preventing it from sliding shut. Marco's gut went cold. "Would have been easier to come in that way," Wu observed. "Hold the light there," Marco told him, extending his arm with the Glock out in front. He ventured another few feet, eyes fixed on the open door, his head bent. The buzzing of flies engulfed his ears. He batted them away. There was something else. Something he needed to hear. A few feet further, past the stairs, he heard it again. A heavy thump, and then a whispery sliding. Then a thump again. Footsteps. His pulse pounding, he focused on the rectangular doorway. Felt himself jump when a pale hand reached from the shadows and grabbed the frame. A slender, feminine hand. His mind leaped. "Danielle!" No, he scolded himself. Not Danielle, dumbass. An older female corpse slithered through the door. A black dress hung in tatters from its bony body, exposing shriveled tits. It goggled at Marco, ice-white eyes sunk deep in its skull. Strands of brittle silver hair dangled in its face. And it wasn't alone. 2, 3, 4 corpses creeping in, and more behind them, pasty figures swaying in the dark of the adjoining car, shambling into the diner. "I knew it," Marco muttered. "Fucking knew it." Without pause, he aimed his Glock straight into the middle of the female's forehead, tightened his finger on the trigger. Behind him, the flashlight clattered to the floor. Blackness overtook him, as if he'd been thrown into a sack, and he'd lost his mark on the corpse. "Christ!" he shouted, more pissed than frightened, and spun around. He couldn't see shit. "Whoa!" On the floor, the flashlight rolled in a lazy semicircle, sending light into the wall, then rolled back to face the waiter's station. "Whoa!" Suddenly Marco wasn't pissed at all. Suddenly he was pretty fucking alarmed. Wu was there, slammed against the counter, thrashing, wrestling with a heavy-set corpse. A fat monster in a soiled conductor's shirt, ticket punch bouncing from its belt, its face a vicious white snarl. It slung its bulbous arms around Wu's neck, squeezing him towards its teeth. The tables, Marco realized stupidly, his thoughts spinning like tires in mud, trying to grab hold. Hadn't checked beneath. The corpse must have crawled out. Jesus Christ. "Doc!" Wu began, but his hand slipped from the counter. He crashed to the floor, kicking up bones, and the dead conductor pounced on top of him. Marco choked the crowbar, bit his lip. Here we go. Head-banging time. He charged a single step, and faltered as the older female clenched its hands on his shoulders from behind. Before he could whirl, the corpse pitched itself against him, and he stumbled to the left, surprised. Surprised again when his ankle buckled under him, and the floor opened like a pit, and all at once his vision spun topsy-turvy. With the female corpse pinned to his back, he toppled down the unlit stairwell, down to whatever waited in the shadows below. White fireworks ruptured the blackness, pain lighting the nerves in Marco's visual cortex as he crashed sideways down the stairs. He hit the last 4 steps on his chest and slid, as if being scrubbed on a washboard, his teeth clacking, the female corpse screeching in his ear. Halfway down, the stairwell turned. Marco and the corpse met the wall with a terrible snap, brittle bones splintering into toothpicks under the female's skin, and they flipped, a tangle of hot and cold limbs, their foreheads knocking. For an instant, the corpse's mangled lips were so close to his own that he could have kissed it. Horrified, he planted his foot and shoved off. He felt himself airborne again, this time falling backwards, somersaulting down the second short flight of steps. He landed with a thud on his ass. The floor was wet, soaking through his pants in moments. His boots slipped as he scrambled to his feet. Christ, the air reeked here, fierce like ammonia. His eyes flashed left, right, straining into the dark. Waist-high countertops, cupboards, shelves, the deep basin of a sink. He'd found the kitchen. Feeble light trickled into the room from a single glass pane, a muck-covered window on the opposite wall, facing west out of the train. He hadn't detected it earlier from outside. The jeep had driven along the unending chain of cars on the east, where the diner's bottom level had appeared windowless. "Nice going, genius," he grumbled. "Would have been a lot fucking easier to break in here, through a window. Next time, check the other side of the train." Frustrated, he gave himself a rapid checkup, bent and unbent his arms, flexed his knees. Sore, but nothing broken. Probably just a few more bumps and bruises for his collection, and thank Christ he'd held on to the Glock and the crowbar. 2 reassuring weights in his hands. The female corpse hadn't forgotten him. It faltered down the last step, grunting, arms outstretched. A marble-sized diamond crowned its ring finger. Fleetingly, Marco pondered the fate of its husband. One of the mummified bodies upstairs, or another walking corpse on board? Or had the husband escaped? Fuck it, Marco decided. Nobody escapes. Incensed by his own nihilism, he lashed forward and rammed the point of the crowbar up through the female's nose, the easiest path to the brain he'd discovered years ago, until he felt the tip punch past the nasal cavity and lodge in the prefrontal cortex. In a single motion he wrenched the bar, ripping the brain in half, and twisted the female's head around on its shoulder until he heard the vertebrae in the wrinkled neck groan and shatter. The corpse flopped to the floor. Shadows lurched on the stairway. More corpses coming. "Woo!" Marco screamed up the steps. No answer. Then a crash. Marco backed away. A cluster of corpses rounded the corner, descending into the gloom. Enough dark, he thought. Let's turn the lights on. He wheeled, the Glock ready in his right hand, and fired 1 bullet into the filthy pane on the western wall. The gunshot thundered in the small kitchen, the reverberation so intense he heard knives and ladles on wall hooks chattering against themselves. The glass exploded. Sunlight flooded the kitchen. Much better. He blinked, ears ringing, and shaded his eyes with the gun. Suddenly he understood the putrid smell he'd noticed in the darkness. The floor was a stew of liquefied rat bedding, turds, and piss. He'd stumbled into a nest. So that's how this post-apocalyptic world worked. Flies ruled the top level, rats below in a sub-kingdom of spoiled vegetables and cupboard perishables. Along the counters, brown, hairy bodies scurried for safe crevices, terrified by the light and noise. Not a bad idea, he reckoned. I could use a crevice myself. A dead couple emerged from the stairwell, a male and female decked in red sweatshirts emblazoned with University of Arizona decals, followed by another male and another. Daunted, Marco retreated around a stainless steel island occupying the center of the kitchen. He passed 3 shelf fixtures stocked with canned soups, fruits, pasta. Wu's gonna have a feast if he's not already dead. And stopped at the broken window. Shattered glass crackled underfoot. The window wasn't big, but it was big enough for an escape. With the crowbar, he hurriedly crushed out the remaining glass and swept the shards from the sill. The male corpse rounded the island faster than the others. Marco lifted the Glock and fired, sending the rats into a fresh squealing panic as the corpse rocketed backwards, its face caved in, pieces of skull spinning across the island tabletop like broken eggshells. Black ooze spewed over the Arizona logo on its chest, soaked into the cotton. The female stepped over the body. Corpses continued to march downstairs. The kitchen had filled, 10, 15, circling the long counter towards him. Time to get the hell out. "Woo!" he called one more time, hopeful. Nothing. Damn it. Marco hesitated, but there was really no choice. He grabbed the sides of the window and heaved his upper body through the opening, all the way to his waist. Then screamed as rotten hands grabbed at his face, corpses outside, on the ground. He dangled halfway out of the window, terrified, certain his momentum would drop him into the crowd. 50 or 60 dead passengers from the coach cars. They must have heard the jeep, disembarked. He remembered the open exit at the rear sleeper, and mobbed here beside the diner, drawn by the commotion. The window was 8 feet off the ground. Thank Christ, or he would have been lunch. Gasping, he kicked his legs and squirmed back into the kitchen. So much for an easy exit. 10 bullets left in the Glock. Wouldn't even make a dent in the crowd outside. Not much help here, either. Corpses packed the kitchen, and on the floor above he heard more creaking footsteps, more raucous gargles and moans. His heartbeat ticked like a stopwatch. Think fast. The female in the sweatshirt touched his shoulder. Faster! He dropped and spun under the steel tabletop. Shit, he thought, immediately second-guessing himself. Bad move, Henry. The corpses had the island surrounded. Peering out from underneath, he saw dead, spindly legs blockading him on all sides, like the bars of a cage. The female corpse in the sweatshirt bent under the table, a ratty ponytail of hair dangling from its head. Marco shot it through the cheek. The ponytail snapped like a whip as the head tore backwards and the corpse crumpled. 9 bullets left. Need a new plan. Let's go, let's go! His hands vibrated with adrenaline. His mind raced through 20 bad ideas in a second, and then he had no more seconds left. The corpses had figured him out, poking their heads under the table, smacking their dry mouths. They'd crawl under and drag him out screaming. Grim-faced, he gathered his legs under him like a sprinter at a starting line, ready to dash out from the table, make a mad rush to the staircase, knock through the corpses, pop a few with the Glock, hope for the best upstairs. No other option. He tensed, flexed, and... "Doctor!" Marco froze. "Doctor, can you hear me?" Wu. his voice distant, hollowed. "Hey!" Marco yelled back, surprised at the relief in his own voice. A dead hand touched his foot, and he yanked it away. The corpses were on all fours under the table, coming for him. In the kitchen he heard a loud clattering, a banging of metal, something falling. "The dumb waiter!" Wu's voice shouted. Marco puzzled, not understanding. "The dumb waiter!" Wu repeated. "Look!" "Gotcha." Marco didn't answer, didn't have time. A thin, broken-nosed corpse wriggled towards him from the front. He shoved the Glock between its lips and pulled the trigger. Its brain exploded from the rear of its head, and before the body even hit the floor, Marco was scrambling over it, his fingers slipping through the chunks of wet gray matter. 8 bullets now in the Glock. He prayed he wouldn't need them. Corpses closed in from the left and right. He felt a tug or two in his shirt, but none too firm, and he pulled free, skittering out from beneath the table. Standing, whirling, he frantically scanned the kitchen. The banging had come from there, in the wall, a small, closed door. To his left, another wave of the dead mobbed the stairs, a march that never seemed to end. He high-stepped over 2 corpses still halfway under the table, their legs kicking, and flung open the dumb waiter. Jackpot! The AK-47 lay in the narrow chute, a gift from Wu up above. The sight of the gun strengthened Marco at once, an instant detoxification of the fear in his bloodstream. He was clear again, back in command. "Thank you," he said, and snatched up the automatic rifle. He wheeled first to the corpses advancing from the stairs, unleashed a barrage of steel core bullets that tore through necks, popped heads like balloons. The gun kicked ass. He'd never fired an AK before. His shoulder would be a giant purple bruise tomorrow, slammed again and again by the kickback after each shot, but he didn't give a shit. It felt fucking good. The roar was ear-splitting, and all else was impossible to hear. His eyes told him everything he needed to know. Corpses breaking apart, holes punching through walls, pots and pans flying off hooks, the kitchen floor sloshing with black blood and rat urine. When the last corpse dropped, he released the trigger, dizzy, out of breath. His eardrums throbbed, still echoing. He swung the gun around the room, body to body, on the lookout for movement. The slightest twitch and he'd let rip again. Nothing. He checked under the island tabletop. Good there, too. He limped to the open window, where the dead passengers outside were battling to climb into the kitchen. He wasn't worried. Corpses couldn't climb for shit. He paused there above the sea of discolored waving arms, feeling like a rock star, like the goddamn Beatles pulling into Liverpool Station to greet the fans. They all want a piece of me, he thought grimly. He considered opening fire, but that would be senseless. He had no idea how much ammo an AK clip held, and these corpses weren't an immediate threat. Not worth the bullets. Better to go find Wu. Get the hell back to the jeep without being seen. But first, rest. He sagged against the table. His body felt 50 pounds too heavy. This day was catching up on him, big time. He let a minute pass before he ordered himself up. All right, lungs, back to work. He was ready to backtrack upstairs, grab some canned fruit on the way out, when a massive jolt pitched him sideways, nearly threw him face first into the rat shit. He dropped immediately to one knee and grabbed hold of the tabletop. His entire body shook. The fruit cans rattled on the shelves. At first he thought he was crazy. He had to be wrong. But seconds later he knew he was right. The train was moving. In the corridor, behind the locomotive cab, Wu threw the knife switch, the large metal tong connecting the battery to the train starter circuit. Would the power be drained? After all this time, would it be as dry as the desert? A soft crackle reassured him. His fingers danced over the circuit breakers, flipping pegs as he went. He hadn't operated a train in almost 20 years, and yet the movements were automatic and gratifying. His chest swelled, and briefly he felt himself transformed. A teenage soldier again in the People's Liberation Army, manning the disaster relief train through slashing rainfall and underwater fields, a national hero, risking death to evacuate women and babies from the Yangtze River floods. And then he blinked, surprised. He missed that life. Back before he'd been chosen for MSS. Now no more saving lives. Now he killed for the good of China. He frowned and focused on his task. He hit the switch labeled fuel pump, then scrambled to the engine room and primed the diesel's fuel system. Once the air was flushed, he cranked the lever, and the starter motor growled. Hurrying, without waiting for the system to pressurize, he released the handbrake and cranked furiously until he felt the train shudder and roll. Then he jogged to the cab, leaping over the two carcasses in the corridor, the mangled bodies of two engineers, fused together into a single slop of decomposition, and freed the set of double brakes on the control stand. All set. He pulled the throttle towards him, locking it into the first notch. The entire train rumbled under his boots. To his rear, the main generator bit into the traction motors, and the locomotive lurched forward, slow, still picking up the weight of all the cars behind it. 4 or 5 corpses blocked the track ahead, snarling at him through the window. Their gray faces didn't even register surprise as the train dragged them under, ground them like meat. He inched the throttle another notch. Crawling through the desert, picking up speed, Wu nodded, satisfied. 10 minutes earlier he'd been pinned beneath the conductor corpse in the dining car, struggling against death. Marco had plummeted downstairs to the kitchen, the female on his back. He'll die, Wu had thought. The words bubbled in his mind, then burst and were gone. Nothing he could do about that now. Nothing but fight to survive himself. And so he'd rammed his knee up into the conductor's groin, but the corpse didn't flinch. Instead it raged and snarled and clawed atop him, crushing him into the floor of the dining car. The dried-out bodies of massacred passengers surrounded him. Old bones splintered and broke beneath his back, stabbed at him through his shirt. Close combat with the dead was difficult, Wu realized. Blows that neutralized human enemies were useless on corpses that didn't feel pain. Frustrated, he hooked his hand under the conductor's neck. The flesh was overripe, squishy like bad fruit, and his fingers sank in with ease all the way to his knuckles. The corpse grunted, infuriated, unable to get its teeth down for a chunk of Wu's face. Wu twisted for a look up the aisle. More corpses coming. From the kitchen below, a gunshot roared and glass shattered. So Marco wasn't dead yet. Wu blinked, annoyed at the distraction. Focus here. He needed a weapon, something to beat back the attack, club the conductor, not kill it, of course, unless his own death was the only other option. The AK-47 on his back was tangled with his day pack, impossible to pull. With his free hand he yanked at his deer-horn knives, but they were lodged in his belt, pinned by his hips. What else, then? A meter from his right shoulder, the flashlight shone towards him on the floor. The beam spotlighted the conductor's grim complexion. Pickled skin, veins thick as licorice bulging under the surface, a black spiderweb across its jaw and cheeks. Wu grabbed at the flashlight. Missed it. Another gunshot exploded in the kitchen. Then Marco's voice, faint but urgent. "Wu!" Wu ignored him. Focus. His fingers closed on the flashlight. From the conductor came a sound like an alley dog growling, its throat curdled with disease. It grabbed Wu's wrist and yanked, breaking his chokehold under the chin. His eyes widened as the corpse lunged for the kill. For an instant, the open jaws struck down at him, ropes of saliva stretched like brown taffy between the teeth, the tongue swollen and black. He rammed the flashlight into the corpse's mouth as hard as he could. The metal barrel punched through the top row of decayed teeth, lodging deep into the throat. The corpse bellowed, a cry muffled by the thick flashlight. The bulb end protruded from the dead man's stretched lips. Wu squinted, half blinded by the bright beam, and pounded the end with his palm. The blow drove the flashlight another 5 centimeters deeper. Yellow pus oozed around the barrel, dribbled down the corpse's chin. It jerked away, surprised, fumbling for the light. Wu gasped as the heavy weight lifted from his chest. On the same outward breath he coiled both legs and planted his boots on the dead man's chest, then shoved. The corpse flipped backwards, smashed into a booth as Wu leaped to his feet. He swung the AK-47 from his back and held it sideways in front of him, one hand on the barrel, the other on the stock. Then charged the corpses advancing single file up the aisle. The rifle caught the lead corpse, a young black male in a Hawaiian shirt, smack across the chest, and the corpse reeled back, toppling the others behind it. A third gunshot screamed from the floor below. Now, Wu thought, it's time to help the American. He glanced ahead. Corpses packed the narrow stairwell descending to the kitchen. He needed another way. Instantly he knew the answer. The dumbwaiter. Hollow moans sounded through the open metal shaft. Wu bent to the square hole and called, "Doctor! Doctor, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Then, "Hey!" Wu fed the AK-47 through the opening and let it drop, heard it bang to the bottom. No other choice but to use the firearm, he reasoned. It was the American's only hope. "The dumbwaiter!" Wu yelled twice. "Look!" And then he bolted. He didn't know if the rifle would do any good, if the American could even reach it, but he had risked enough. The rest was up to Marco. A strobe of light swept over his shoulder, danced on the walls. The dead conductor was up again, the head of the flashlight a bright beacon in its mouth. Wu pulled his deer horns and hopped onto a tabletop in the nearest booth, then leaped to the next booth, the next table, safely passing the corpses in the aisle, heading towards the open door at the north end of the dining car, towards the engine room. His real reason for boarding the train, not the lie he'd told the American. Wu wanted the locomotive. At the dark doorway, he hesitated, peering into the next car. The lounge. Without the flashlight, his vision was weak, but he sensed no movement, no hungry shadows. He stepped over the mound of bodies and dashed straight through the lounge. The door at the opposite end was open, and streams of sunlight beckoned him into the next car. A coach, the windows smashed. Behind him, somewhere lower, he heard the pounding beat of gunfire. The AK. Marco. Wu sprinted through the coach car, then stopped halfway. Out of the windows he saw a mass of corpses, rioting, swarming both walls of the train. 20 meters back on the dune, corpses surrounded the jeep, invaded it, crawling inside, tearing the seats, as if they'd detected a scent of life, some trace of Marco and Wu still present. And then, as Wu watched, the jeep shifted on the unsteady sand, too many corpses climbing and pulling, and with a slow motion the entire vehicle flipped and rolled twice, a groaning orange ball of metal and broken, flopping limbs and crushed bodies down to the bottom of the dune. Wu remembered Marco's warning. Pissed off hornets. The American had been right. But that no longer mattered. Good riddance to the jeep. Without further hesitation, he'd flown up the aisle and run through the next coach car to the final door, the engine room. The door was open half a meter. He'd wedged his shoulder into the gap and heaved it wider, then slipped through, and brought the locomotive back to life. Now, Wu removed his day pack and dropped it to the floor. He felt suddenly buoyant, unburdened by the weight of all his gear. And from a few cars behind he heard the AK-47 rattle off another volley. Marco. The doctor was upstairs, alive. Wu's shoulders relaxed. With some surprise, he admitted to himself that Marco's survival was preferable, at least until the mission was complete. The doctor's instincts did, indeed, seem useful. And of course, Beijing wanted Marco alive, too. For a short while longer. Outside the front window, sand dunes undulated on the horizon. A century and a half ago, poor Chinese laborers had laid the first cross-country railroad through these same western deserts. They'd perished by the thousands at the behest of the American government, slaving for minuscule wages, only to be cast aside when the railroad was complete. Banned from white society, denied citizenship, scorned and branded with the hateful slur, coolies. Wu stirred. He hoped the spirits of those Chinese were watching now. He hoped they felt honored at last, witnessing their blood-stained tracks convey him on a mission to serve the homeland. The Sunset Limited rolled half a mile from where Wu and Marco had boarded. In the rear mirrors, Wu saw the rioting corpses fall farther behind, shrinking into the desert until they were just another texture like dirt or cactus or rocks. The overturned jeep was a speck too, then gone. Marco's gear and supplies gone with it. A smile hardened on Wu's mouth. He glanced at his own day pack resting against the console. Everything he needed was right here at his feet. Kang Wu was in control again, not Henry Marco. Bullets bursting from the AK-47, Marco advanced through the remaining coach cars, mowing down corpses. The train swayed from side to side, making it difficult to aim. He fell against seats, wasted bullets, too many misses between headshots. Just as the AK sputtered, the clip empty, a flashlight blinded him from ahead. "Whew! God damn it!" he began, but stopped. The dead conductor charged down the aisle, its mouth stuffed with the burning head of the flashlight. Marco threw the AK down, came up, firing with the Glock. His first shot missed, but the second bullet shattered the flashlight, exploding the batteries out the back of the conductor's skull. The fat corpse stumbled 2 more strides, then collapsed in a mound. Waste of a flashlight, Marco thought. Way to go, Wu. He retrieved the empty AK and shouldered it for later, assuming Wu had more clips, then pressed ahead with the Glock. He dropped 5 more corpses, 5 headshots, leaving a single round in the Glock, and arrived, ears throbbing painfully, at the locomotive. Inside the door, 2 bodies blocked a narrow, blood-painted corridor, the train's engineers. They'd fossilized in mid-struggle, one atop the other. One's rib cage had been torn open, organs ripped loose. His hand gripped a screwdriver buried into the other's skull. Marco imagined the scene. The first engineer resurrecting, assaulting the second. Killing each other at the same moment. Teamwork at its best, Marco thought, stepping over the bodies. Then again, who was he to judge? My partner just left my jeep in the fucking dust 2 miles back. The car lurched beneath him as he stumbled up the corridor, past fat pipes and gauges and loud, hulking engines the size of refrigerators. The corridor widened at the end. At the locomotive's nose sat Wu at a tall stool behind a console of dials and levers, gazing out through the windshield, absorbed in his thoughts. His hand rested on the throttle. "What the hell are you doing?" Marco demanded. Perhaps Wu flinched. Marco wasn't certain. The soldier swiveled halfway around on the stool. "Removing us from danger," he said, much too matter-of-factly. Marco stared in disbelief. "Oh, yeah? And what about the jeep?" "Upside down, being torn to scrap metal, the last I saw. This was our only escape." "Bullshit," Marco cut him off. "Stop the train. We're going back." "Impossible. Too many corpses." "Jesus, Wu, use your head. All my shit was in the jeep. My bag and all my gear and supplies. Maps. My guns." "You're carrying 2 guns now, Doctor. How many do you need?" "More than 2, asshole." Unperturbed, Wu swiveled back around. Through the windshield, the scenery had begun to evolve as the train streaked towards Yuma. Paved roads cut lines in the desert. Telephone poles appeared alongside brown cactus husks. The tracks passed a lonely liquor store with smashed windows. A begrimed red car sat outside, abandoned, doors rusted open. "I won't need a gun," Wu said. He spoke without looking at Marco. "Only my knives. You have 2 guns. The rest of your belongings, however, are a loss. I'm sorry." Marco seethed. "You don't sound sorry one goddamn bit." "Listen," he said, controlling himself. "I mean, really, listen. I warned you about boarding this train. You ignored me, twice. Now you suddenly decide to play choo-choo on your own fucking whim? That was my jeep. I need that jeep. Your Uncle Osborne will replace it. A gift from the United States government." "You're missing my point. Do not make any more decisions without me." A suburb of tan adobe houses had appeared out of the western window, and beyond that an old golf course, the once green grass, now a dead brown rug. To the east lay a small shopping center. The parking lot was a wasteland of overturned shopping carts, interspersed with haphazard mounds of rags and bones, human remains, picked by vultures. Wu clicked the throttle forward 1 notch, and the train slowed. "We'll keep our speed low through town," he said. "There may be blockages on the tracks." "Wu," Marco began. "Doctor," Wu interrupted, "I'll ask you again to remember that this is a military operation. In which case, who makes the decisions? The uniform with the most stripes. And in that regard, I outnumber you 3-0. Back there I observed through the window as 50 corpses overturned your jeep. There was no time to ask your opinion. I made the decision." "Great choice, Sarge. Should I salute you?" Wu rose from the stool. "We're both quick thinkers, Doctor. It's our strength. But sometimes we do what the moment requires and accept the consequences later on. Like losing the jeep, or nearly being killed by a corpse you pulled from a burning truck." Marco's forehead had been packed with pressure like an overheated boiler. At the mention of the burning corpse, his own fuck-up back in Maricopa, he imagined a pop, the steam leaking out, his anger retreating. Shit. Score 1 point for Wu. "So," he said with an effort to stay pissed, "we all make mistakes. Is that it?" "I didn't make a mistake." Wu brushed past him down the corridor. Without missing a step, he hopped over the dead engineers and dragged the rear door closed, securing the locomotive. "I assume you shot the corpses between here and the dining car?" Marco sighed, exasperated. "Yes. Most of our passengers disembarked at the jeep, but there may still be stragglers in the back coaches. So we'll keep the locomotive locked for now. I can disable power to the other cars, but keep it for ourselves here in this cab. This way we can run the AC, work the lights at night. Later, if the train is quiet, we'll make a supply run to the kitchen." Marco rubbed his eyes, barely listening. Run to the kitchen, sure. A little midnight snack. He laughed humorlessly. The tracks had entered the center of Yuma. Outside, Marco saw crumbling offices and apartment complexes, forlorn gas stations, silent hotels, and hollowed-out restaurants that seemed to echo with whispers. The train crossed beneath a highway overpass, packed with a ghost jam of cars, deadlocked bumper to bumper, left to rust in crooked lanes, and then rumbled into a concrete canyon running half a mile alongside two sets of parallel tracks. Ahead stood a shadowy parking garage beside a dull, sand-colored building. The train station. "Shit," Marco mumbled. The platform was packed with corpses, dressed in torn-collared shirts and slacks, others in scummy baseball caps and shorts. Their eyes widened at the train's approach. God knows how long they'd been waiting, and greedily they pressed towards the edge of the platform. The entire first row of dead commuters toppled to the tracks. The 100-ton locomotive roared through, crushing them to pulp. Marco didn't even feel the impact. "We're safer this way," Wu said, returning to the control stand. "You see now? The Jeep was vulnerable. We'd have never made it past that station, not with all those corpses. Instead, we just roll along. For the next 300 miles, we're invincible." "Yeah," Marco said, trailing off. Beside the main console was a second, smaller control stand. He sank onto the padded stool and set the AK down at his feet. The foam cushion felt great. He swore he could take a nap right here, sitting up straight. He pinched his earlobe, rubbed the notch of the old dog bite, reflecting. Wu was right about one thing. The train was invincible, an unstoppable force. As long as they kept moving, they were safe from attack. 100 frenzied corpses didn't matter. Bring 'em on. He sighed and shut his eyes, closing his senses to everything but the rhythmic rocking of the train. Sure as hell smoother than the Jeep over desert rocks. Within moments he felt his resolve soften, succumbing to the momentum, to the forward motion, this non-negotiable, unswerving line predetermined by the lay of the tracks. Hurtling him ahead to California, towards a past he doubted he was ready to face. But that's what this was about, wasn't it? Face the past. Get it over with. "You're avoiding," Danielle's voice echoed in his head, weeping, twisting his heart. "You're always avoiding, Henry. It's not fair. It's not fair to me." He defended himself. "No, I'm not. Not this time. Full speed ahead." Yes, he would allow this, surrender control, sit back and enjoy the ride. And anyway, he hadn't been in control for years, had he? Finish this and go home. He repeated the thought more slowly. Finish and go home. That's all that mattered. Who gives a fuck how you get there? For the first time that day, his neck muscles loosened. Maybe this idea was good. And anyway, it was nice, not worrying about getting eaten for once. "Okay," he said, opening his eyes, finding them moist. "What the hell? Punch my ticket to L.A. We can stop at the Jeep on the way home, right? By then the corpse party should have ended. I busted my ass to find all that gear. I'm not giving it up so easy." Wu shrugged. "We can try." "Wow. Thanks, Sergeant. I can tell you really care." Marco bent and unlaced his boots, eager to stretch his feet, feel some air on his toes. "But how about we take a lesson from our two funky-smelling friends in the hall? Let's try to get along, okay?" Wu considered the dead engineers, each murdered by the other. Nodding, he glanced at Marco, then turned his attention back to the tracks. "Don't worry, Doctor," he said evenly. "I'm not ready to kill you yet." Chapter 7. Intruders. The night sky in the desert never seemed quite real to Marco. Not with the stars so exaggerated, so large and bright, and the blackness too low-hanging, as if 1 billion miles of space had somehow compressed against the horizon. Danielle had once asked him, "Can you feel that?" as they reclined on their balcony, savoring a summer night. Her voice was hushed, reverential, what he often jokingly called her New Age wonder tone. "The universe touching the earth," she'd said. Marco hadn't even teased her that night. He secretly did feel it himself, a screwed-up perception that the heavens were impossibly nearby, as though you could simply reach out and stir the stars with your finger, or walk to the desert's edge and hop off into the cosmos with a kick of your feet. It was a sensation entirely different from L.A., where the constant glow of city lights muted the stars and shunted the universe away. Out here, in the unpopulated desert, you lost the people and gained back the stars. Long ago, before the resurrection, Marco had believed that was a good thing. But now maybe a few more people would be nice. The train chugged through the night, chewing miles of Southern California desert. Marco lowered his eyes from the window. Sitting on the floor of the locomotive, stiff and cramped, he bent his legs towards him and rested his head on his knees, then sat up again. As utterly exhausted as he was, sleep wasn't coming easily. At least he'd had a decent meal before bed. Canned carrot soup. Cold and congealed, but still better than another night of dried jerky. He and Wu had gathered supplies from the kitchen without trouble. Marco had been thorough with the AK-47 on his first trip, and the only corpses they saw were slumped in brain-beaten heaps. But just to be safe, he'd dragged shut the rusted door at the back of the diner. It snapped into its latch with a satisfying squawk. If there were any hiders in the rear cars, they weren't going anywhere. In the locomotive, Wu ruled the control panel. He'd dimmed the lights. The night rendered him a shadow against the window, a silhouetted extension of the controls. His hand appeared fused to the throttle. If the sergeant was tired, he showed no sign of it. He perched on the stool as though he'd been bolted to it, solid and straight, his lower jaw as taut as his posture. He'd stripped from his blood-stained military shirt down to a white tank top, revealing a fighter's physique, lean and muscled. Pale scars blemished his shoulders in long, narrow lines, almost like the lashings of a whip, but Marco had been reluctant to inquire. Shortly after sunset, Wu had slowed the train to a crawl. "We wouldn't be wise to reach Los Angeles County in the middle of the night, in the pitch black," he'd reasoned. "We'll pace ourselves and approach slowly. At this speed, we'll arrive after dawn." Made sense to Marco. 10 miles an hour was just fast enough to keep any desert-roaming corpses from seizing a grab rail and hauling themselves aboard. For now, the two men could relax, sit back, and catch some slumber. And God, I need it. Marco closed his eyes. His body swayed, his shoulders jostling below his heavy head as the locomotive rocked him to sleep like a gentle mother. He and Wu had agreed to take shifts, 2 hours each, one man napping, the other on watch, tending to the train's alerter. The dead man's switch, Wu called it, a safety mechanism that disabled the train if the engineer was unresponsive for anything longer than 25 seconds. In the darkness, Marco heard a soft bell, and then a demure tick, as Wu tapped the alerter button. Beneath him, the train wheels clacked a monotonous beat against the tracks, an endless, metallic lullaby. California, he thought, half dozing. He'd been happy there once. He and Danielle in California, before everything went to shit. Would any of this have turned out different, he wondered, if we'd stayed? If we'd stayed. His thoughts skipped to the tempo of the tracks. If we'd stayed. If we'd stayed. But they hadn't stayed. They'd fled, hoping for better in Arizona, and now he didn't belong back here, back in Cali. An intruder, that's what he was, sneaking through an open window at night. His heart rang loud behind his ribs, like an alarm sounding. He'd felt the first pang right after Yuma, just across the Colorado River. The train had exited Arizona finally, met at the border by leafy eucalyptus trees along the California tracks. He'd last traveled this way 3 years ago, the summer after the resurrection, before he'd gotten caught up in all this crap, before his first contract, before he'd become... What did Osborn call him? The zombie hitman. Before that, he'd just been a scared man, nothing more, sweeping the West Coast for Danielle. Christ, what a summer that had been. Through late winter and spring he'd dug in at the Arizona house, laboring over his barricade, enslaved by the conviction that she'd return there. She hadn't. But he'd begun to notice things on his supply runs into town. Blue-vested corpses shuffling through Walmart. Dead males in blood-soaked jerseys camped in sports bars. Rotted young mothers slouching on playground benches. Empty eyes watching empty swings. All with such a palpable expectancy, he could feel them waiting for God knows what, that a growing suspicion took hold in his head, telling him their movements weren't random, that perhaps these mindless mechanisms of dead flesh and bone weren't so mindless. Perhaps they were nostalgic? Wistful? As crazy as that seemed. Finally, on a sweltering July night, he'd pulled out his maps. His checklist had been exhaustive. 4 typed pages, a catalogue of remembered date nights and theaters and Café La Bohème and yoga retreats and organic markets and Disneyland and public parks and the Ritz-Carlton and studio movie lots where she'd made her films. And then, hopeful, he'd packed the Jeep and headed west. He'd started at the top of the list, Tech Town, where they'd met. No Danielle there. Only the young assistant manager, dead and hungry, mustard-colored pus bubbling from its burst lips as it crawled out from behind the return counter. Disappointed, Marco had filled his pockets with batteries and escaped. In total, hundreds of miles covered, hundreds of memories, each tarnished as it came up empty, just another meaningless place in a meaningless world. Yet when he'd reached the bottom of his list, he'd started back at the top. He had to be sure. The California search had taken 3 months. Here, in the train, the soft bell sounded again, followed by the quiet tick. Marco's head dipped. Swooning, he saw himself in his Jeep, heading back to Arizona after that last California trip. Defeated, befuddled, aching for Danielle. The radio crackled with nothing but angry static, but he refused to turn it off, shouting instead over the noise, apologizing to her as he drove drunk for 2 days straight, weaving across lanes of forever empty highways with only himself to kill, begging her to come home, to be dead with him. Home. Arizona. They'd moved there a year before the resurrection. A year after? He faltered, couldn't bring himself to complete the thought, not even in a dream. "California's too much," he'd told her, the safe way to phrase it, summarizing words he wished to avoid. The position at St. Joseph's had opened in Phoenix, an amazing opportunity for him. For them. Things would get better, he'd believed. Danielle would be happy. They'd stop arguing so damn much. But he was wrong about that. Her voice, her bewitching alto, descended on him in the dark locomotive, dreamlike. A night bird swooping down to sit on his shoulder. Sharp talons. It hurt. "You knew I didn't want to come here," she said. "Bullshit," he answered. That was his line, the script always the same. "You said—" "I moved for you, Henry. I gave up my career." "Christ, that's revising history, Dell. You weren't getting parts." "Oh, I wasn't? You asshole." "You said you wanted to be near your sister." "You know what I really wanted. You're avoiding Henry." "Bullshit, I'm not." "You said we'd try again." "I know what I said." "I wanted—" "Well, I never promised." A man's voice cut in, loud and urgent. "I can save Hannah." Marco jerked awake. His damp shirt clung to his clammy skin, and he shuddered. The locomotive had turned cold and inhospitable while he'd slept, refrigerated by the desert night, the floor unforgiving, like a mortuary slab. Blinking, he rubbed his hands together and settled his fast heart with long, deliberate drags of air that stretched his lungs to capacity. He was thankful for the chilled air, shocking him to full alertness, locking his wild nightmare back into whatever subconscious cage it belonged, unable to harm him until his next sleep. Still, even as the sounds and images faded, and his pulse slowed and his breath evened, he couldn't stop shivering. He couldn't forget Danielle's words stabbing him. Fragmented arguments, lodged inside him now like splinters under the skin. And the last voice in his dream, the man's voice. That voice had been Roger Ballard. Marco swallowed. Funny how his dreaming mind had paired Roger with Danielle, stitched them together, ganged them up against him in a war of words. "I can save Hannah." "But you didn't," Marco mused. "You fucked up." "We both did." He felt his stomach clench. This trip to California was screwing with him. Again he had the sensation of rushing headlong towards— what? Towards something terrible. "You're awake." Wu's austere voice jarred Marco. He'd almost forgotten the sergeant was present, immersed in the shadows up front. Jesus, please tell me I wasn't muttering in my sleep. "Yeah," he answered, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. "Want your turn?" "No." "Come on, I'll tuck you in. I'll sing you a song." Wu stepped into the dim light. His face was carved with concern. Marco sat up, alarmed. "What's the matter?" Wu pointed into the midnight world beyond the window. "We're being followed," he announced. Marco gawked, paralyzed by the report that Wu had just given. Followed? For several slow seconds the words skimmed atop the surface of his comprehension, important but lacking meaning, then broke through with a crash into his deeper brain. "By who?" he demanded. "I don't know," Wu answered frankly. "They're not with me." Wide awake now, Marco struggled to his feet and almost doubled over. His legs had cramped during the uncomfortable hours on the floor. Steadying himself against the wall, he hobbled to the window and pressed his palm against the cold glass. Outside, the night sky was still at full power, still perplexing, the blackness bright with starlight. The terrain lit up with an unexpected clarity. Silver ironwood trees and patches of desert scrub stubbled the land. 100 yards of track gleamed ahead in the locomotive's spotlight. Beyond that, The full moon bore down like the oncoming beam of another train. Only the distant mountains were obscured, rocky ridges lurking at the desert fringe like an audience in a dark amphitheater encircling the stage, ready for the next performance. Marco scanned the landscape. His neck crawled with the eerie sensation of being observed by someone unseen. He leaned until his forehead tapped the window, stealing a view as far back as he could along the vast length of the train. The glass fogged as he gulped anxiously. It didn't matter. He couldn't see a damn thing anyway. "Where?" he asked, impatient. "Straight behind. In the mirror." He squinted into the tall rear-view mirror bolted outside the glass. In its depths bobbed a dot of sharp red light. The back end of the train. But beyond that, nothing. A washed-out reflection of himself hovered in the window, frowning. "I can't see shit," he said. He was about to pull back when Wu cut the locomotive lights, and the cab went truly dark. Without the backlighting, Marco's reflection vanished, and at once he was able to discern shapes where none had been. And there it was, the tiniest coal-colored fragment in a gray sea of sand, half a mile behind. From this distance, Marco wouldn't have noticed it without Wu's guidance. At a glance, the speck could have been a rock or a tumbleweed. A minute passed before he was even convinced it was moving, keeping pace with the train, purposely hanging back at the outer range of eyesight. "Some type of all-terrain vehicle, a four-wheeler," Wu concluded. "A quad. He's followed us for the last quarter hour, perhaps longer. I detected him once the sand turned paler. An error on his part. He should have remained on the tracks. Better cover." "But who is it?" Marco asked again. "I mean, are you sure it's not your men? Maybe Osborn sent backup." Wu shook his head. "If that were RRU, he would have caught up and made contact by now. This individual is stalking us. Poorly, but his intentions are clear." "Oh, yeah? And what are his intentions?" "He wants to know where we're going." Marco exhaled, exasperated. "Jesus Christ, can you stop with the half-answers? Why is he following us?" A pause. Without the interior lights, Wu's face was a silhouetted mystery, but Marco sensed the sergeant was regarding him with disdain. "Really, Doctor," Wu said at last. His tone had changed from concern to admonishment. "Did you think we're the only ones hunting Roger Ballard?" Marco blinked. "What? What are you talking about? Who else?" "Other political interests. Governments." Marco backed a step from the window. "Oh, shit," he said. The realization hit him like dynamite blasting through dense rock. He bumped into the stool behind him and sat. "Nice job, Henry," he thought, shaking his head. "What the hell have you gotten yourself into?" "Other nations." "How many?" "We're hunting Roger. Goddamn son of a bitch. He'd been an idiot not to predict this. National security, Osborn had said. Of course. If U.S. Homeland Security was playing this sick game, then there'd be other pieces on the game board, too. Other governments with Roger on the agenda. Marco's mind raced to catch up with the implications. This isn't a contract, he realized. It's some kind of world war. But for Christ's sake, why? And what if he didn't win? "So who is it?" he asked yet again. The urgency had faded from his voice. He heard only resignation. "North Korea? Iraq? China?" Wu interrupted. "Any of those, perhaps? Or others, it doesn't matter. They all want the same." He brushed past Marco to the control panel. "Move!" "Sure. Sorry to bother you," Marco griped. He surrendered the stool, moved to the opposite console. The empty can of carrot soup he'd eaten for dinner sat by the base. He gave it a rude kick, gratified to hear it bang away into the shadows and roll down the corridor. Unfazed, Wu grabbed the throttle and yanked it towards him a notch. The engines in the hallway groaned louder. The train kicked forward, rocking Marco backwards on his feet. Wu waited 20 seconds, then upped the speed again. 2 minutes later, he had the train barreling at 90 miles per hour. He consulted the mirror and nodded, satisfied. "Gone," he declared. "Quads top out at 70, even the military grades. He won't catch up now. He'll be cursing himself." "But, he won't just give up, will he?" Marco asked. "No," Wu admitted. "He'll stay on our trail. I suspect he knows who you are and that you're tracking Ballard. However, I doubt he knows our destination is Sarsgaard, or he wouldn't need to follow us. He'd be there already. Therefore, we still have the advantage. We'll abandon the train at San Bernardino as planned. But I can rig the alerter so the locomotive rolls on without us. He'll follow the tracks, not realizing we're not on board." Wu sniffed. "He'll find the train crashed at the L.A. terminal with 1 million corpses to greet him." Marco squeezed his raw eyes shut. The revelations swirled madly around him like sheets of paper in a tornado, and he desperately wanted to snatch them up, assemble them in proper order. "Okay, let me get this straight," he said, his eyes snapping open. "This guy's a spy, right?" Wu flashed an annoyed glance. "Foreign operative, yes, I would think so." "On the same mission as us? To kill Roger?" "Yes." "But why? Why does everyone want Roger's corpse returned?" Wu cocked his head to the side, furrowed his brow. Marco sensed him contemplating an answer, deciding whether to serve up another half-truth or a flat-out lie. At last the sergeant appeared to make up his mind. "That's not all they want." "Meaning?" "Meaning that killing Ballard is not the end objective." "God damn it," Marco declared. He'd had enough. He strode to the opposite side of the control panel and grabbed the throttle, squeezing until his knuckles whitened. He half expected Wu to slap his hand away. Instead, the soldier's eyes narrowed, not a look of surprise, but curious, interested to see what Marco would do next. Marco met his gaze, refused to waver. "Enough vague answers," Marco said, his cheeks broiling. "Remember our deal? Honor system. I gave my report, now it's goddamn time you gave yours. Or should I stop this train and let our new friend catch up? Maybe he'll be nice enough to explain what's going on." The corners of Wu's mouth constricted. In the unlit cab, his face was more shadow than skin. Black, bottomless pits loomed where his green eyes had glinted hours earlier. The two men held their positions at the console, each measuring the other, motionless, except for the sway of the train. Finally, the alerter's soft tone broke the quiet. Ping! A pause, and then it rang again, and then again. Ping! 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 Like the bell at the end of a boxing round, instructing the fighters to separate. Wu's hand emerged from the darkness around his waist. The deer-horn knife gleamed in the red glow of the control instruments. Without blinking, he rested the blade on the console, slowly, deliberately, inches from Marco's outstretched wrist. "Let go of the throttle, Doctor," Wu said. Marco held tight. "Or else?" Wu said nothing. Ping, 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 the bell rang and rang. Any moment now the safety brakes would engage automatically and drag the locomotive to a stop. Ping, ping, ping. With an unhurried movement, Wu released the knife and pressed the alerter button with his empty hand. The bell ceased. "Let go of the throttle," Wu said, "so I can tell you important details about Roger Ballard. Details I'm sure you don't know." Marco exhaled. "So," he said warily, "you're honoring the honor system?" "Of course," Wu answered. "I've said so already. Honor is everything to me." Marco nodded, unhanded the throttle, flexed his fingers. "Okay," he said. "Tell me, why does the world want Roger?" "After you moved to Arizona, did you ever hear from Dr. Ballard?" Wu asked. He sat atop the stool, monitoring the rear mirror. "Well, no," Marco admitted cautiously. "That wasn't something either of us would have wanted. Once I left L.A., that was it. I didn't keep in touch. Not with anyone." Slumping against the cold wall, he grunted and slid down to rest his tired ass on the floor. He crossed his knees in front of him and gazed up at Wu like a kid ready for story time. "So then you aren't aware that Ballard quit his residency 4 months after you left?" Wu delivered the news without shifting his attention from the window. "Roger quit?" "Abruptly. He announced his resignation on the morning of the 28th of September 2013. 10 minutes later, he was gone. Down to the hospital lobby and out the front door, and never returned. Left his diplomas hanging on the wall in his office." Wu spoke with the matter-of-fact inflection of a military briefing, detached, dispassionate. "Roger quit," Marco marveled, still absorbing this first detail. Guilt nipped him with sharp little teeth. He should have known this information already, should have remained better attuned to what he'd left behind. Obviously, Roger had been in pain over what happened. But the truth was, at the time, Marco didn't give a shit. And maybe, just maybe, he'd wanted Roger to suffer. "But why?" he asked Wu. "No reason given. He simply announced he was leaving, and not only leaving the hospital—" Ping! Wu swiveled from the window and tapped the alerter. "Ballard vanished." Marco flinched without knowing why. "I don't understand." "I mean, Doctor, that he abandoned his apartment as well. His clothing, his furniture, his belongings, all left behind. Hospital security discovered his blue BMW in the parking garage, also abandoned. He'd driven in that morning, but evidently departed by another means. Even his bank accounts were discovered untapped. Not a dime withdrawn. A missing persons report was filed by hospital administrators, since, as you know, Ballard had no next of kin to pursue the matter. But mysteriously, no action was ever taken either by the L.A. County Police or the Federal Bureau of Investigation." "Jesus Christ," Marco trailed off. "So where was he?" "From the 28th of September 2013 onwards, no one knew." "And yet," Marco prodded, "something tells me Owen Osborn knew." Wu nodded, although his stern expression was not encouraging. "Perceptive, Doctor. Yes. Ballard had been recruited in high secrecy by the Department of Homeland Security. Osborn organized the disappearance and the cover-up." "Great!" Marco flared. "So we're cleaning up some mess Osborn made. He pisses all over the floor, then sends us out with the mop?" Unrattled, Wu considered Marco's remark and then turned once more to the window. "It's a much bigger mess than you think, Doctor," he replied at last, gravely. "Osborn was busy cleaning it, too. Which brings us to why we're here." Marco shuddered. A much bigger mess. The link between Roger and Osborn disconcerted him, along with the feeling that he, too, was trapped in the same spider's web, that the wisp of silk binding Marco to Roger also tied him to Osborn, weaving them all together into a dizzying circular trap. And somewhere, hidden beyond his understanding, waited the spider, the reason for everything, the logic spinning the web. And suddenly he guessed what it was. Jesus, Roger. Jesus fucking Christ. Tell me why, he said, his throat rasped. Why Roger was recruited. Wu placed his hands square on his knees. You seem to know already, Doctor. The resurrection. Yes, Wu confirmed. The resurrection. Marco rubbed his eyes, dumbfounded. His fingertips were frigid in the night air, and he could feel rough veins scratching below his eyelids. Osborn needed a skilled research neurologist, Wu continued. Ballard was the best in his field. And so Osborn selected him to contain the resurrection. Marco blinked, reabsorbing the dim light. Contain? As in, stop? Wu nodded. That was the intent. Before the outbreak. Hold it back up again, Marco said. He had to slow this down, understand it better. How did Osborn know about the resurrection before the outbreak? Ping! The alerter bell sounded, and Wu slapped the button with his palm. He seemed irritated by the interruptions to his narrative. Summer 2013, he announced brusquely. Federal agents working for the Department of Homeland Security received reports of an unknown encephalopathy with highly alarming symptoms taking hold in the population of a high-security medical prison. And yes, Doctor, before you ask, it was Sarsgaard Medical Prison, our current destination. The Sarsgaard physicians had never seen anything like it. A near-total neurological shutdown followed soon after by necrosis and cease-functioning of heart, lung, and other major organs. All this while the patient apparently still survived. Of course, it was soon determined. They actually were dead, Marco broke in. But they walked around and ate people. You can skip all that. I've heard it before. Get to the part about Osborn and Roger. Wu scowled. I'm getting there, Doctor. At the time of these reports, Sarsgaard incarcerated a number of international terrorists, 3 members of the Islamic Jihad group, 1 soldier of the Lebanese Asbat al-Ansar, and a high-ranking officer in the Japanese Aum Shinrikyo. As you recall, this was a time of heightened precaution against terrorism in America. The concern, the fear, was that one of the jailed terrorists was a carrier for some biological weapon. An engineered virus, perhaps. Or bacteria. So Osborn wanted Roger to take a look. Yes. Osborn anticipated that Sarsgaard was just the beginning, an accidental preview of an impending widespread bioterror attack, a doomsday weapon to be released throughout America, with no possible way to predict where or when it would happen, or who would deliver the blow. Osborn needed a vaccine ready. Or even better, a cure, when the time came. In the meantime, the events at Sarsgaard were a highly guarded secret. Marco hung his head, combed his hand through his unkempt hair. His fingers came away sticky with soil and sweat and gummy corpse blood from the day's kills. Repulsed, he wiped his hands on his canvas pant leg and stood, aching. Okay, he said. Roger disappeared after I left for Arizona. That means what? He was hiding here 6 months, trying to figure out what the hell makes the resurrection tick? Obviously with no luck. He had outfoxed him, which, knowing Roger, must have been agonizing. Millions of people killed by a puzzle he couldn't solve. And it killed him, too, in the end. He was close to a solution when he died. That's why Osborn needs his corpse. Yeah, that's the part I don't understand. You will soon, Doctor. Wu's finger hovered over the alerter button, anticipating the next chime of the bell. The truth is, he began, and even the alerter seemed to hold its silence, hushed, awaiting his next words. Wu shook his head gravely. Roger Ballard's corpse is not like any other corpse on Earth. Marco felt his forehead screwed tight, baffled, needing more. Wu obliged him. I'll explain, Wu stated before Marco could ask, his tone once again official, a reporter of facts. During the first rescue attempt at Sarsgaard, 4 years ago, Ballard's lab was overrun by his dead patients. His research was destroyed. All Osborn had to show for his efforts was a smattering of reports that Ballard had provided prior to the outbreak. Since then, Osborn has had a team of scientists in the safe states attempting to create a vaccine, but with no success. Marco didn't see where this was going. Roger's a tough act to follow, he offered. Osborn would agree with you. He'd been losing hope, but 2 months ago that changed. Wu paused as if feeling a change himself. 2 months ago, Homeland Security detected a trespass into the encrypted mainframe of their database. A computer break-in. Someone, somewhere, had managed to hack into Roger Ballard's personnel file. Luckily, as the hack was in progress, the CIA tagged the hacker with an invisible string code, like an old-fashioned tracking device, allowing them to secretly follow the hacker's subsequent activity. Okay, and then, within 72 hours, the unidentified hacker had trespassed into several additional government sites, including the U.S. Correctional Department's private files on Sarsgaard. To the CIA, the threat was obvious. Espionage. Some foreign power digging for information, seeing what they could learn about the resurrection, and Osborn's attempt to develop a vaccine. Marco puzzled, still not getting it. And now they're looking for Roger? Because? Wu delivered him a curious look. Before I answer that, Doctor, I should first mention that in addition to the government mainframes, the hacker was also observed breaking into email accounts. 12 or so. Accounts belonging to former associates of Roger Ballard. Presumably the hacker was looking for information Ballard might have leaked to an outside contact. The hair on Marco's scalp stirred. Something about the way Wu was watching him. Wu continued, a coy note creeping into his voice. For example, one notable break-in occurred on the mail server for a certain hospital in Arizona. St. Joseph's. Oh, shit. Marco's head buzzed. And there, Wu said, with the CIA watching, a most incredible discovery was made. Oh, holy shit, you have got to be kidding me. Wu nodded. Yes, Doctor. You've guessed. Marco groaned. Roger emailed me. You're surprised. Understandably. Osborn was surprised, too. To say the very least. But when? You never received the email, Doctor, because you had already fled the hospital. Ballard's email to you was sent the day following the rescue attempt at Sarsgaard, more than a week after the public outbreak of the resurrection. You were gone by then, in hiding, fighting to survive yourself, no doubt. Society was in freefall, the country in chaos. Ballard's email simply vanished into a discarded, forgotten server, like an artifact of a lost civilization. Marco rubbed his face, his hand a cold, hard weight against his cheek. Roger had tried to contact him? For what? An apology? A farewell? What did he say? Marco asked. He had to know, of course, but goddamn, the answer scared him. His stomach flexed. He swallowed back, the anxiety rising up his throat. I explained that Ballard's research on the resurrection was lost during the raid, Wu said. As it turns out, that was not entirely true. He sent a partial summary to you, Doctor. Marco blinked. Me? He puzzled for a moment. Why me? An interesting question. The CIA's theory is that Dr. Ballard believed he could trust you. He apparently did not share the same high opinion of Owen Osborn. Marco scoffed. Well, I don't blame him for that, but still. His thoughts swam as if he'd been plunged beneath black, frigid water, choked off from logic and reason. Jesus Christ, Roger, why? Why do that after all the shit you caused me? Why me, of all people? Can't you just leave me fucking out of it? I don't want your bullshit, you crazy asshole. And then his mind broke to the surface again, and he sobered. Fine, he heard himself say, his voice oddly flat. So now, the million-dollar question. What was in Roger's research that sent Osborn hunting across America to kill his corpse? Wu leaned forward, just perceptibly, on his stool. Ballard's email revealed just how near he'd been to discovering the vaccine. Remarkably near. Far closer than Osborn had imagined. Are you familiar with DNA vaccination, Doctor? Marco shifted, frowning. A little. An experimental method for developing a vaccine. The idea is to take blood cells from a healthy person and then inject the virus or bacteria directly into the nucleus, into the DNA. The cells divide, and you do it again. And again, actually, hundreds of times. You need a ton of generations of mitosis. Finally, if it works right, a new nucleotide for white blood cells might evolve, specially adapted to kill the disease. It's like placing a special order for custom-made antibodies, but that's only if it works right. Nobody's perfected it yet. He paused. Of course, you're about to tell me that Roger perfected it. Typical Roger. Wu nodded. He was close, yes. And what else do you suppose I'm going to tell you? That the healthy blood cells Roger used for the experiments were his own. You do know your friend well. Marco couldn't help but bristle. I'm not sure about the friend part, but I do know that Roger could be a goddamn idiot, take any risk for science. His voice had turned bitter. Wu seemed not to notice. Ballard detailed his process in his email to you. Over a period of 17 weeks, the doctor collected blood samples from himself and implanted the nuclei with the resurrection under a microscope. Then he'd re-inject the cells back into his bloodstream, hoping they'd divide and propagate, hoping to create genetically altered blood using his body as a breeding ground. His objective was to convert his entire system to the new DNA. Yeah. That sounds like Roger, Marco repeated. And it worked? Not quite. Not enough to be used as a vaccine. But after countless cycles of injections, Ballard did report that infections occurred noticeably slower when his blood was mixed with corpse blood in a Petri dish. He believed he was very close to success. Another month or two, he might have evolved the correct antibodies. He simply ran out of time. During the rescue attempt, he was bitten. Wu nodded again. He seemed on the verge of speaking, but instead he swiveled on the stool and reached below him into the shadows. From underneath the console, he dragged out his day pack and unzipped a side pocket, then reached inside and handed Marco a small bundle of papers, 2 or 3 sheets, crisply folded. The locomotive swayed below Marco's feet. He took a breath, unfolded the papers, and his eyes, straining in the moonlight, surveyed the first page. He wasn't surprised at all. An email. From R. Ballard. To Henry Marco. Date, 13th of March, 2014. 10:36 a.m. Henry, this is important. As you know by now, an outbreak has occurred. Marco stopped, already annoyed. Typical Roger, he thought again. No hello, or how are you? Sure as hell, no, I'm sorry. Just drill straight to the facts. Skip past everything human. Grumbling, he flexed his jaw and scanned the remaining pages. Indeed, the facts were all there, or a summarization, at least, of all that Wu had told him. The experiments, the DNA, the antibodies, but not enough detail to replicate the process. Osborn must have been pissed. The last sheet ended with a few short, emotionless lines of text. My bite wound is severe. The resurrection is too strong for the current antibodies. My body is shutting down, becoming a corpse. Take care of my notes, Henry. Roger. Marco sighed and refolded the papers. So he knew he was dying. And wished to bequeath you his knowledge, Wu added, before he resurrected. The trouble is, we need more than a hastily written email. Marco shuddered. His anger had gone cold, and beneath his shirt his skin had turned clammy and damp. He didn't want to imagine Roger's last moments, his thin face shading blue, gangly limbs all racked with agony, reaching out to Marco with some insane last wish. So Roger's blood is evolved, he said unsteadily, and then suddenly it all made sense, as if the paper bundle in his hand was an X-ray, a window into total darkness, revealing every hidden bone. Roger is the missing link to the vaccine, he continued, now certain, now clear, almost challenging Wu to dispute him. But first, Osborn needs Roger's DNA. So we're on a hunt to collect some Super Ballard blood for Osborn's boys in the lab. Now you understand, Wu said. And our new friend, the stalker back there on the quad, he's after the same thing? Yes, Wu agreed, and, reminded of his concern, cast his eyes to the rearview mirror. Finding no cause for alarm, he refocused on Marco. Osborn realized that whoever had hacked into Ballard's email would attempt to retrieve a sample for themselves. He ordered us, I should say, to locate Ballard's corpse first before anyone else. It's a race, with Roger's head as the finish line. Very clever, Doctor. The good news is you're still in the lead. Yeah, well, I don't like it. Marco chewed his lip. And anyway, why fight over the vaccine? What does it matter who gets there first? Wu raised an eyebrow. Think, Doctor. A vaccine for the resurrection represents a major shift in world politics. Right now, only America has fallen. However, governments worldwide are in frantic preparations for an outbreak of their own. The nation that learns the secret to controlling the resurrection would do more than ensure its survival. That nation would vault to the top of the new global paradigm, an instant superpower. The vaccine is a gold mine, worth trillions to the economy in production and distribution, and its political worth is virtually infinite, a supreme bargaining chip with other governments, allies and enemies alike. Any infected nation needing the vaccine would have to beg at the feet of its master. And if the master doesn't want to share, Marco mused, everybody's screwed. Quite. Wu studied the rear mirror again. So now you see why we're being followed, and why we can't stop or go home. Osborn desperately wants his great American comeback. The last thing he can allow is another country beating him to the Ballard corpse. Great. And what if none of us can find Roger? Wu stared, deadpan. Then Osborn never lets you stop looking. Marco grimaced. Outside, the black sky had softened to a listless gray as dawn approached, and the stars sank back into the unknown universe. In another hour the sun would rise and rule the desert again with a tyrannical heat. Nothing could stop it. His shoulders sagged. He had a feeling he wasn't ready for whatever the next 24 hours would bring. Everything he'd just heard was incredible. The stakes so high he could barely believe his own involvement. World power, Genetically altered blood? He'd listened intently, seeking some false note, some indication that Wu was making this shit up as he went. But now, Wu's answers made sense, seemed to snap into place with Marco's own intuitions. So Wu was telling the truth. Except that Marco's mind buzzed again with the same thought he'd had earlier that day in the Jeep, a nagging sense that Wu was hiding something. But what? What else could there be? The sergeant had answered every question, held nothing back, explained everything. Marco stirred. Everything. His ears popped, congestion clearing like a cold little bomb going off in his skull, and then he knew what wasn't right about this. Wu knows everything. So just one more question, Marco said, for First Class Sergeant Wu. Wu had returned to monitoring the rear-view mirror. At the mention of his rank, the muscle in the side of his jaw flexed. "Yes?" he asked tersely. Marco hesitated. He took a bolstering breath, then fired. "Who are you, really?" Wu half-turned, avoiding eye contact, and focused instead out of the window, as if studying something far away. Marco was certain his suspicions were correct. The man knew way too damn much for a sergeant, shouldn't have had answers to half this crap. But just then Wu's eyes bolted wide. "Down!" he shouted, and threw himself to the floor as Marco looked on, stunned. And without further warning, the train's windshield exploded. A hot sandblast of shattered glass against Marco's left cheek, and a small metal gas canister banged into the cab, spewing orange smoke that clawed his eyes and invaded his lungs, and he cried out in pain as the smoke filled him, burning, choking. He couldn't breathe. He had to escape. But too late. The sky turned black again. Night had won and extinguished the sun, and Marco crumpled, unconscious and lost within the orange gas, filling the train. Marco was awake, or not, he couldn't decide. Sitting in his office at Cedars-Sinai. "I can save her, Henry." Roger Ballard planted his fists on Marco's desk and leaned forward, not quite threateningly, but with such intensity that Marco edged backwards in his chair. The rectangular lens of Ballard's eyeglasses assigned his face an extra austerity, an accent to the bony ridges of his cheeks and chin. Behind the glasses, Ballard's pupils flickered with excitement. Marco sensed his hunger. Then he noticed the black veins spiderwebbing under Roger's gray skin. Marco shuddered. His mind was a fog, thoughts drifting slowly through the murk, then gone again before he could capture them. He squeezed his eyes shut, confused. "Wait," he said. "Roger is dead. Aren't you, Roger?" "I can save Anna." Ballard's lips were unmoving as he spoke. So this was a dream. A dream, right? Marco glanced down at his desk. Atop the familiar green blotter was his desk calendar, scribbled with appointments, notes, reminders. He squinted. He couldn't read a single word. Ballard spoke again. "I can save—" Marco interrupted. "No, Roger, you couldn't. You tried, but it didn't work." He didn't mean to sound angry, but he did. Angry and blaming and bitter. Ballard jerked as though he'd been slapped, and suddenly Marco's cheek stung. Somehow he'd felt it too. Pain electrified the side of his head. "The asphyxia is severe," Ballard explained, "but if we cool the brain beyond—" Marco stopped him again. "It didn't work. You shouldn't have done it. You made it too cold. The metabolic strain was too great. She died." Ballard shook his head. No, I can save her, Henry." "You killed her!" Marco spat. He felt his body pulling away, changing locations against his will, as if he were being dragged, and now he was standing in the hallway outside the special care neonatal unit. He wanted to enter, but the door to the treatment room was locked, the knob unyielding. Suddenly the door shook. He heard shouting voices on the other side. Then the shout stopped, and the knob clicked. The door opened, and Roger's decomposed corpse shuffled out. Its face was stricken, anguished. "Pulmonary hemorrhage," it said. "Brain dead." "Why, Roger?" Marco pleaded. "Why did you do that?" Ballard studied Marco. He seemed lost, his mouth opened, groping for words. "You shouldn't have emailed me," Marco groaned, then winced as another whiplash of pain lit up his cheek. "Wake up!" Slap! 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 His eyelids cracked open, even as his eyeballs still rolled in his head. The sky was pink now, early dawn, the horizon tilting like a seesaw, up, then down. His head felt stuffed with wool, a fat mass packed between his ears, soundproofing his skull. He heard nothing but muffled noise, a scraping, the sound of someone retching. Himself, he realized, warm vomit splashing his chin, and he remembered being grabbed by his feet and dragged over dirt, 100 years ago maybe, or only just a few seconds. His thoughts were sluggish. He could feel them clinging stubbornly to the very bottom of his consciousness, and he waited dumbly, minutes and minutes, for each to lose its grip and rise, float to the surface, and pop like bubbles so their meaning could escape. Slap! Someone had just struck him across his bruised cheekbone. "Wake up!" The voice was like a pair of sharp scissors cutting through the wool in his head. "Roger?" he asked, disoriented. "Still a dream?" "No." "Yes." "No." "Woo?" He tried. He was lying on his spine, his arms stretched back behind his head. He stared at his feet far away. His eyes refused to focus, and blurred contours made his legs seem confusing. He tried to sit himself up. He couldn't. His arms were stuck. He didn't understand. A hazy figure hovered over him, the rough shape of a man. "Woo?" "Birth asphyxia," Marco mumbled. His lips were numb. The complex syllables were difficult to push across. "Hypoxic, ischemic, encephalopathy." "What'd you say?" The sharp voice again. Marco continued, concentrating, yet woozy. "Neonatal condition. Newborn babies. Born not breathing. No oxygen to the brain. Roger-induced hypothermia. Standard treatment. Cool her to 33 degrees Celsius. 3 days. But Roger went lower. Risky. The asphyxia was severe. He wanted to save her. No brain damage. But she died." "Roger who?" demanded the voice. "Roger Ballard?" Marco wet his lips with his tongue. His head pounded with pain. But his ears were crackling, clearing. He felt a cool morning breeze freshen his forehead, his words smoothed, flowing easier. "Roger wants to keep the brain alive, without oxygen." He stopped and frowned. His eyes had firmed, and at last his surroundings took solid shape. He was laid out amidst a tangle of gray branches and bushes on a rugged embankment of desert earth. The dirt was bone-white, a paler bleach than Arizona. 20 feet down, the hill bottomed out onto a bleak 2-lane highway. Telephone poles spooled off forever to the north and south, and smaller roads broke away from the main highway, skulking towards distant houses and ugly structures that looked like industrial warehouses. He saw rotting bales of hay stacked at intervals across parched fields. He was on the outskirts of some remote California town. Across the road he saw a dilapidated shingled building, more like an oversized shack, hunkered in a dirt parking lot filled with ghostly sun-whitened cars. Orange cones marked the corners of the lot, and around the perimeter a half-assed fence of nylon rope was strung between rusted metal posts, decorated with small plastic flags of blue and yellow and red. He squinted at the building. Over the entrance, burnt neon tubing looped and twisted to form the word Bill's and a giant mug of foam-headed beer. A bar. This was wrong. It took Marco another moment to realize why. "Why aren't we on the train?" he asked. The simple question seemed to crash through the last obstructions in his head. Suddenly he was sharp and rational, able to remember. "Down!" Wu had yelled, and then the explosion through the windshield, the metal canister, the smoke. Someone had gas-bombed the locomotive, knocked Marco halfway into a coma. His mouth was sour with the aftertaste of the toxin. He hawked and spat into the dust. And then he realized why he couldn't move. His arms were handcuffed, chained backwards to something above his head. Grunting, he wriggled his body, craned his neck. He was shackled to the rear tow bar of a quad. The vehicle was dirt-splattered and coffin-brown, splotched with desert camouflage, the size of a golf cart but squatter, lower to the earth, with a scooped-out driver's seat and handlebars to steer. From behind, it looked like a mutated motorcycle with 4 monster tires, each treaded deep for off-road traction. "Whoa!" he called, alarmed, snapping his head back to where he'd seen the shadowy figure. "What the hell?" he began, then sucked in a quick breath. "You're not Wu," he said. The man crouching beside him was dark-skinned with a black nest of beard, framing 2 cracked lips and disarrayed yellow teeth. A desert-colored beret lay flat atop his head. He wore a green camouflage military jacket and loose cargo pants, neither of which matched. A soldier, maybe. He was too disheveled, too haphazardly outfitted, like some grunt in a guerrilla army, or a mercenary, perhaps. Sure as hell not U.S. military. On his breast pockets and shoulders, loose threads outlined spots where embroidered patches had been torn off, as though he had no allegiance to any flag, any division, any nation. "Whoa," the man grinned. "Who's that? Your friend?" His voice was deep, American. Twisting on his chain, Marco scanned both left and right, his forehead steamy with a fresh sweat. No sign of Wu. He turned back to the soldier. "Who the fuck are you?" The grin vanished from the soldier's ugly mouth. He slouched forward and boxed Marco's left ear with a heavy backhand. All around him the desert flashed white. Marco scrunched his eyes, felt a tear dribble onto his lashes. The pain was familiar. He waited for it to subside, then reopened his eyes. He remembered the half-dreams he'd had while knocked unconscious by the gas, the sensation of being slapped. Wake up! This jackass had been hitting him. Now the man was scratching his knuckles on his beard, grinning again. His pale blue eyes shone with malice. "None of your business," he said. "Fuck you, that's who." "Nice to meet you, too," Marco muttered, his earlobe throbbing. Despite his tough talk, he was afraid, stricken with the sensation of being crushed, as if the 400-pound quad had rolled over onto his chest. He swallowed dryly. "Oh, God, I'm in deep shit here." Over the horizon, the sun had grown larger, coaxing more color from the land. Yellow desert sunflowers winked cheerily from a patch near Marco's feet. He saw his Glock on the ground, and the AK-47 laid out beside a dusty brown day pack. Next to them was a gun that looked like a grenade launcher, Probably used to fire the gas canister into the train. The soldier picked up the AK and carried it to the quad. On the side of the vehicle was a makeshift gun rack, a network of frayed bungee cords holding a shotgun, an axe, and some sort of squat-barreled machine gun. He added the AK to the collection, then returned and knelt beside his pack. Marco hesitated, then dared to ask, "Where's Wu?" He braced, awaiting another punch for an answer. The man ignored him. Instead, he pulled a brick-sized walkie-talkie from a side pocket of his day pack and flicked it on. "Conquest 3, he barked. A coarse voice crackled from the speaker. "Conquest 3, what do you got?" The soldier paced away, and Marco lost the conversation. A minute later, the soldier returned, nodding. "Hell yeah," he finished. "See you soon." He clicked the handset off. Marco tried again. "Where's Wu?" The soldier held up his hand as if to say, "Be patient." He returned the radio to his pack, then stood and grabbed Marco by the ankles. Before Marco had a chance to kick away, the soldier dragged him in a half-circle, orienting him feet first up the embankment. Blood rushed to Marco's head, pushed against his eyeballs. Under his spine, the ground was hard and stony. The chain on his hands jangled as he swiveled. The soldier dropped him to the dirt with a solid thud. "Your bud on the train?" the man asked, gesturing west past Marco's feet. Marco looked. From his new position he could see up the hill, past the prickly scrub. There was the Sunset Limited, motionless, dead on the tracks. The alerter had shut down the driverless locomotive. Orange smoke wheezed from a hole in the windshield. "Wu, right?" the soldier said, smirking. The name seemed to bring him amusement. "Yeah. Found him taking a nap up there. The gas got him sleepy." He made a gun shape with his thumb and index finger, then aimed the imaginary weapon at his temple and fired. "Pow!" he said, and splayed his fingers wide to mimic splatter from his skull. "Bad news. I shot Wu." Marco grimaced, felt his stomach contract. Wu's dead. The thought clamped onto him like another shackle, steel and inescapable, as certain as the chains on his trembling wrists. He was alone now. No way out. Wu's dead and I'm fucked. A dull, sad weight hung from his heart. However ambivalent he'd been about Wu, he was tired, too fucking tired, of people around him dying. Still smiling, the bearded soldier reached to his belt. From his hip he unclipped a keychain and dangled it theatrically, inches from Marco's face. A small black box danced at the tip of Marco's nose. It was a wireless control of some kind, with a round red button in the middle. Satisfied that Marco had seen, the soldier snatched the device away and planted his thumb on the button. Dried brown blood caked in the creases of his knuckles. "Bye-bye, Wu," the man said, then squeezed the button. A red bulb blinked 3 times on the box. For a full second, the desert seemed to hold its breath, silent, expectant. And then it exploded. From everywhere at once, a massive hammer plummeted down on Marco's skull, pounded a deafening spike through his ears, and he cried out in pain as the locomotive erupted in a volcano blast of flame. A tremendous ball of fire that grew and grew, giant and terrible, as if the sun had finally descended to swallow the desert. The locomotive rocked on the rails, and shock waves tore down the hill to suck the air from Marco's lungs as a huge chunk of fire snapped off into the sky. Glass rained over the tracks, and then it was quiet again. The blackened shell of the locomotive settled into the earth, its sides bent outward, black fumes spewing from gashes in the steel. Small flames crackled between the wood rail ties. A 40-foot piece of shrapnel, and a coffin for Wu. Marco clenched his eyes shut, his jaw hanging, his eardrums beating with horror. Suddenly something hard clacked against his front teeth. Metal. The soldier had jammed the barrel of the Glock into Marco's mouth. It tasted foul and oily. "Now," the soldier said, "you're gonna take me to Roger Ballard, right?" His blue irises burned hot like gaslight. He twisted the gun painfully against Marco's tongue and wiggled his trigger finger. "Or pow, like Wu." The soldier laughed.
This audiobook has been broken into multiple parts to make the download faster. You have reached the end of a part, but not the end of the complete audiobook, so please check your library for the next part of this audiobook. Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program. This is Audible,